right. We're going to call to order the Boulder City Council study session of February 26, 2019. We have a couple of items before us. The first one deals with mobile homes, and the second one, a variety of issues teed up for us by the Human Relations Commission. Before we get started, just a couple things. One is, you guys may recall that we are having, on March 19th and 20th, a bunch of the, I don't know how many, tribes are coming to have a 2-day session with us. And you may recall that some parts are open to the public, and all of us, the entire city council, is encouraged to come. And then other parts are, government to government consultations, so only 2 council members can attend. And some I'm supposed to attend to do the pomp and circumstance. And, this will be circulating for people to sign up, council members. So it's kind of complicated, but it'll circulate during the meeting. I guess that's it.
Can I do one other housekeeping thing?
Yeah.
We all should have received today an email from Jennifer Ferris at the Deputy Director of the Library with draft poll for the library poll. Remember, we agreed a few months ago that we had to poll the community on. So Lisa and I have served on the polling committee with Johnny Teeter. So the poll that you got in your mailboxes today is the product of 3 or 4 meetings that we've had. So if you would all respond back to Jennifer by a week from today with any comments you have in the poll, that would be much appreciated.
Okay. I guess the only other thing I want to tell you is that the US 36 Mayors and Commissioners Coalition going to DC tomorrow for our annual lobby trip with all the muckety-mucks from around here to go and pitch a couple of our transportation projects. And yes, I'm going on that, but it'll be my last time. Anyhow, just know that, and I'm going to send around all the materials to you all so you can be aware of the messages about the specific projects we're pitching, but just an FYI to all of you. Okay, and with that, we'll do mobile homes. Yeah.
So good evening. Before I start, I have a housekeeping item as well. So we have a translator here tonight, Marina LaGrave, and I'm going to hand it to her so she can make the same announcement for any individuals that are here.
Es, cualquiera persona que necesite interpretación al español, aquí tenemos copias de la presentación al español y los aparatos para la interpretación.
Yeah, so our presentation is in Spanish here as well. So I'm Kurt Fernhauer, Director of Housing and Human Services, and this evening we're going to be talking with you about an update to the manufactured home strategy. And I'm joined tonight by Brenda Rittenauer, Crystal Launder, and Jeff Yagan. And Aaron Poe is also here, and Jeff Arthur is here if we have any infrastructure discussions as well. The mobile home or manufactured home communities have been valued by our city for many years. There's many policy things that we've put in place, many programs that we've put in place. And one of the residents that I'll be highlighting shortly, Isabel Sanchez, she lives at the Mapleton Park. And I think she really demonstrates the leadership and community aspects for Mapleton. She's been on the HOA board for 11 years, and we've worked with her with some difficult and challenging issues there. And she's really committed to her community. But the thing I found interesting is that like her and other families, they have a sister or a brother or an aunt or a mother who live down the street with their families. And it really creates a special place. So if you could go to the next slide, I'll just read a quote from her. At present, 3 of my adult children have purchased mobile homes in Mapleton, and a 4th is currently in the closing process. I have come to value the unique sense of community fostered in Mapleton. So tonight, we're going to look at three. Well, we're going to start off by giving an overview of some of the city initiatives and give highlights of the community engagement that's occurred to get us to this point and what we heard from the community. And then we're going to have sort of 5 areas of focus that we're going to present to you. And the goal is to get feedback from you. Are these the right areas of focus? And what would your priorities be around them? So one of the council members, I believe, at CAC asked also for an update on Ponderosa. So this past week, we put an annexation application into the city. It includes a site plan and really a plan for how Ponderosa would be developed over many years. Focusing initially on the infrastructure and getting that upgraded, and then gradually replacing some of the older homes with energy efficient homes on foundations. There's been a huge amount of community engagement on that, and we have a resident leadership committee there that meets on a very regular basis. We have office hours out there, and it's a tremendous community going through some very difficult change, and it's a difficult process for them. But we're glad that they're participating in letting their voices known around having input to what their community will be like in the future. So with that, I'm going to hand it over, I think, to Jeff. Thank you.
Good evening. I'll give you a short overview of how we approach development of a manufactured housing strategy. We'll provide a significant amount of background that's drawn from the memo and other sources, talk about the engagement and the results of that, and then move into the items that we're particularly interested in hearing from you about, the proposed principles for decision-making around manufactured housing communities, and then the areas of focus for developing work plan items, potentially. The approach has been to divide this project into 3 phases. We've completed the first, which is that of inquiry and information gathering, and we have presented that to you. We're in the middle of the second right now with you to try and sort what we learned into something that's actionable. And then our third phase of this will be to flesh out those actions into work plan items that are can then be prioritized and incorporated into work plans if you so direct us. The input we're asking is, of course, if you have thoughts about what you have in your experience or what you've seen from what we have gathered, but particularly we're hoping to hear from you, as Kurt pointed out, if the areas of focus are the right ones, if some should be prioritized over others, and either in terms of work effort or in terms of calendaring, that would be particularly useful. We are not proposing to go ahead and do any of these work items in the next couple of months. Rather, we're proposing that they be fully scoped as work plan items to give you a sense of the options to accomplish the goals in each area and what that might cost in terms of time, effort, and potentially money to do. One thing we want to point out is that the city has had a long-standing policy that unlike most parts of the country, we want to keep manufactured housing communities as a vital, important, valuable housing option for our community. And the Boulder Valley Comp Plan has had for almost 2 decades now the outlines of what we're trying to accomplish there, which is to preserve the parks that we have, develop new ones if possible and when possible, try and find opportunities for residents to own and control their communities, and then to address health and safety issues ideally before they happen. So those are the main components of the adopted policy. You'll see the strategy as we've developed it is organized around these and has some actions or work plan items that could address them in many different ways. So for a quick overview of background information, I'll hand it off to Crystal Launder. And
good evening. So I'm just providing this background information as somewhat as context and then also based on requests by council members. So to begin with, 2.8% of Boulder's housing stock is manufactured housing. That's about 1,300 units. I think the significance of it that we understand is that it's a detached, relatively affordable housing stock. And there are 4 communities located inside the city limits. So that's Boulder Meadows, Mapleton, Orchard Grove, and Vista Village. Those communities were built all between 50 and 60 years ago. All of these communities have pretty much a near zero occupancy or a 0% occupancy. Vacancy. So they're all fully occupied, and it's been that way as long as I've worked for the city. Mapleton Mobile Home Park has 120 permanently affordable restrictions on their on home pads. And then as far as the homes themselves, they're by and large owned, although Boulder Meadows does have 119 licensed rentals. And then another kind of distinguishing factor that comes up over and over again when we talk about manufactured housing is it pre-HUD or is it not? And that's really about, in 1976, they established HUD standards for manufactured housing, and the quality was variable for homes prior to that. So some were, are very high quality, and there's some that aren't so much. Boulder Meadows and Vista Village have a low share of homes that are pre-1976, and Mapleton and Orchard Grove have a higher share. So some of the work that we also did is for the memo was to reach out to the manufactured home community owners, and then also to residents to understand what's happening with rents and rent increases in those communities. Currently, the market rate rents in the market rate rents in Vista Village, Orchard Grove, and Boulder Meadows range between $725 and $800. And we've also looked at these rent increases over time. And for market rate manufactured home communities, that's 4.2%, which is similar to a 2-bedroom. The affordable Mapleton had a 0.8% increase on average annually, and the inflation rate was 2.4%. So a little more background on initiatives that have been underway since 2015. When we did our last study session focused on manufactured housing, we've had a manufactured home community consultant for 4 years. Really focused on developing the collective voice of residents by supporting HOAs, also a citywide resident organization called CMOB, or the Coalition of Manufactured Homeowners of Boulder, and then also helping to get the Colorado Coalition of Manufactured Homeowners, which is a statewide organization, established. The manufactured home consultant helped to inform Ordinance 8216, which is on the next slide. We had a 1999 manufactured homeowner handbook that was updated by the consultant. And then we've had 2 consultant teams. And so we've had, with their support, 2 fall forums on manufactured housing have occurred. And there's been a shift more and more towards trying to figure out how to do more inclusive engagement in these communities. So background on ordinances 8043 and 8216. So those ordinances were passed in the last 5 years, and the purpose of them really was advancing manufactured homeowner protections. Ordinance 8043, passed in 2015, limits manufactured home community owners' ability to prohibit the sale of pre-76 homes. It also limited required upgrades to existing manufactured homes. And it placed the responsibility of tree maintenance on the owners of the manufactured home communities. And then the second ordinance passed in 2017 focused on the right to privacy of manufactured homeowners, prohibited retaliation by manufactured homeowners, or manufactured home community owners, and also introduced mandatory mediation.
I have a question.
Sure.
Could you explain how these are enforced? Like the tree maintenance was something that was brought up a couple of times, and with our high winds recently, I can see this around the city. Also, the prohibition of retaliation.
So the enforcement provisions are contained in the code and rely on action taken by people who believe a violation has occurred. The procedure then, and I'll probably defer to our city attorneys if my overview is not sufficiently detailed, is essentially to provide us a notice of a potential violation to the parties. In some cases, it's required to be, that they're required under the ordinance to enter into mediation. In other cases, it would go to our code enforcement folks to evaluate to the extent to which a violation has actually occurred. And then the penalties for non-correction of a violation are, can vary, but are also defined in the code. I don't know if Brenda, if you want to add anything, or Tom?
Well, I understand all of that, but I guess my question goes more to, which ties into the prohibition of retaliation, if it's an individual or whether or not it can be the homeowners association itself. How many times does this happen? What kind of response is there? And maybe those don't all have to be answered right at this moment, but I think in terms of putting teeth into some of these items that we've heard about in your memo, that would be helpful. Tom, do you have anything to add here?
Not really. It's like most of our code enforcement, it's complaint-based. In some areas, we have dedicated resources to have more proactive enforcement. This isn't one where we've done that. So it goes with all of the other enforcement that we do for code violations. So that's something that you could consider, is whether or not we want to provide dedicated resources. That's a council choice.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to the next background item, we were also asked for an update on the 2019 state legislation activity. It's a little bit premature to discuss it in detail, but we're focusing on the state enforcement of the Mobile Home Park Act. We're also looking at county powers to regulate and enforce the Mobile Home Park Act. And then extending time to move or sell a manufactured home upon eviction. And then I know there's a lot of interest in amending the Mobile Home Park Act, and it just seems that generally there should be that some stakeholder engagement would need to happen and inform a 2019-20, so that would happen kind of 2019-2020 is how we're looking at that, to figure out what exactly might be amendments.
If I remember correctly, one of our representatives, Edie Hooten, was talking about legislation. Is there draft legislation yet?
It hasn't been drafted yet. It's in the works. And the second item that we were asked to provide an update on was the rent control bill. And so I reached out again to Carl Castillo for this update. So we do have a state statute, what we call the state statute on rent control, and that prohibits counties and municipalities from enacting rent control. And so that 2019 bill proposes to eliminate the prohibition on rent control. And Boulder was actually part of a successful effort to get the Colorado Municipal League to support to support that bill. However, there's some concerns that there's some opposition in the House, concerns specifically about whether or not that would create substandard housing. And so an idea that you can certainly reach out to Carl about is whether or not it would make sense to do a bill amendment. And then with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brenda Rittenauer.
So it has been my honor and pleasure to support the community engagement portion of this work. We've gotten to talk to many stakeholders, and so I'm happy to be able to share that work with you tonight. As you'll see in front of you on the slide, we've really been trying to follow our new community engagement process, which really is the decision-making process we're trying to adopt as a city. So you can see, because of the timing of when this project started, we've been able to fully utilize the decision-making wheel. So we worked to define the issue before we started. We determined who we needed to speak to, who we needed to bring into the process, and then we really did go to the community to ask them how they would like to be involved before we went out with our questions. And that was an interesting process. I'll explain that on the next slide. We created the plan. We did the plan, which was the sharing information, a foundation of information and inquiry. And now we're here with you to work on identifying those options. So really we went with the first primary audience of stakeholders, which was our manufactured housing residents and the owners and management. It was very important to us to get both sides of that story. And we asked them how they'd like to be involved. And we were surprised by the answer and grateful that we asked. We had thought maybe this is an opportunity to bring everyone into a room together to have conversations together, and that didn't quite fit with how everyone wanted to engage. Everyone wanted to have the conversation where they were really able to bring forward the things that were important to them and that they needed us to hear. So we did a staff-led process where each of us took part in meeting with parts of each of the communities separately. So we met with residents in various ways. We met with the owners and management in various ways. We then also took that out to agency partners outside of our organization and internal departments inside the organization. And we asked them essentially the same questions. So while they were in different rooms, that we were asking for the same information. Really what we were talking about is what you see there, the value of manufactured housing communities to each person we spoke with, the challenges that they see of the type of housing, and their ideas for the preservation and expansion. We would lead with the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan commitment and ask them what they thought would lead to meeting those goals. We engaged in a lot of different ways. We created a web page that had a lot of the background information on it and a survey that people could take online in English or Spanish. We sent out project email updates when they were relevant. On that web page, people could sign up for that list. We ended up with over 100 names on that list. As I said, we met with owners and managers for each of the 4 parks. We did resident outreach in a lot of different ways. We went to CMOB meetings. We had a table at the Fall Forum. We had a table at Vista Village's holiday party, which they were nice enough to invite us to. We also used some of the best practices we've learned at Ponderosa. We really resourced each engagement with bilingual support and with childcare so that it could be as accessible as possible. We did have monolingual and bilingual people participate from at least 3 of the parks, so we felt good about getting that message out. We also did a lot of flyering of doors, particularly in Orchard Grove and Boulder Meadows, where it's been harder for us to engage. We put flyers on every door in each of those parks with ways that people could get involved. And then, as I said, we met with about 9 outside agencies and about 15 different internal departments to get those ideas and values and challenges as well. So as I said, we talked about values, concerns, proposed ideas, and solutions. We got over 300 different unique ideas. and heard repeats of many of those ideas from people. We talked overall to over 100 people. The topics that really rose to the top, you'll see on the slide, housing, which really is about the stock, about the homes themselves, about the types of housing that could be in the parks, the types of housing that are in the parks now, how to preserve them, how to make them be viable into the future. Preservation of the communities, development of new communities, alternative ownership options, including resident ownership, which our residents have taken a lot of time to inform themselves about. Support of diversity and inclusion, a lot of supporting those practices that we're trying to institute for making sure that everyone who lives in the parks is informed and involved when they need to be. And manufactured housing resident and owner management relations. A lot of ideas came up around how those relationships could really strengthen. So turn it over to Jeff.
In addition to learning from people that we talked to and with about these issues, we also conducted some research. We've clearly done a fair amount of work on this in the past, so that formed a foundation. But we did a variety, we consulted a variety of sources and people at national organizations and other communities, and saw what resources were out there to try and assemble a list of ideas that was as comprehensive as possible for ideas that seemed relevant. There's a list of those on page 11 in the packet and the memo if you want to dive in. I also want to thank CU's Sustainable Community Development Law Clinic. They in partnership, they conducted an analysis of all 50 states' relevant legislation for manufactured housing communities, which is one of the attachments B, to help us identify what is going on in other states. And clearly, much of that is being applied to our discussions around what would make sense to do with the Colorado Mobile Home Park Act, but it also has local relevance, and we've drawn from that. So if there are questions on that, they are here to address those more thoroughly than we could. So from all of this input, all of this research, the prior work, all the conversations we had, we took on the task of organizing it, and we tried a couple of things and ended up deciding that the two ways we would present the information and organize it were to try and identify some general principles that we as a community could use in deciding how we're going to accomplish pursue our policy of preserving and expanding this housing option. And then from those and the work that we've done, identify areas where we think more work would make sense. So we would like to go through those three principles that we're proposing and then the actions and then get your feedback. The principles were really an outgrowth of what were fairly clear themes that we heard from talking with people. And by far the most prominent among those, and this includes park owners, agencies, departments, is affordability. This is one of the very important things this housing option offers, is a relatively affordable housing product that provides a living opportunity that you can't find in other ways. So we drafted the language, which you saw in the memo, but essentially, let's keep it, let's see if our actions can help us maintain this option as the most affordable form of detached housing that we have, and actually stay more affordable than other rental properties or at least no more expensive than comparable rental properties. So we'll be interested in your thoughts on that. Next, please. The second one we chose, and we heard from everyone, if we want to keep these parks as a permanent feature in our community, they have to be economically viable. They have to provide a safe and healthy and ideally well-maintained living environment. And that applies to the communities, infrastructure, common spaces, roads, et cetera, and the homes themselves. As Crystal pointed out, most of these communities were built 40, 50 years ago. Many of the homes are approaching that age as well. All housing needs to be updated over time. And so that's part of this, is how well the communities can continue to function and the housing can continue to serve the people that live there. The parks, if they do not operate in a financially viable way, will end up either needing additional funding. In many places, they will close because they can't afford the investments. We would hate to see something like that. So financial viability was called out. And then given that the three parks of the four, and they're the three largest parks in the community, are privately owned, they represent a substantial investment of capital, which capital seeks return. If parks cannot generate a reasonable return on investment, either there'll be no additional capital brought to them, or potentially the costs of investing in them over time will be too significant to maintain the rate of return that's required, so they'll be deferred or put off, which has an effect on potentially the health and safety and livability of the communities, or there'll be upward pressure on the rents, which hurts the affordability principle. So that's why you see that there. And then the third principle we're suggesting is, and we heard loud and clear, is that each of these parks provides a really strong community. It provides an opportunity for people to live in a way that other neighborhoods don't. The community members value living in that particular type of housing with their neighbors in a way that is very strong and has quite a significant value to them. One thing that you will see in the near future is a collaboration with the Boulder Affordable Housing Research Initiative out of CU to really accomplish, if we can, as best as it can be done, a census, as it were, of park residents, so we have a better sense of the demographics of who lives in the parks, what their particular resources and possible vulnerabilities might be. So although we weren't able to get that information compiled yet, that is a feature of this project that will be able to inform the actions as we move forward. So we are proposing these three principles. They were built off of the community input and the research that we've done as a way of trying to guide the decision-making around what we should be doing. They weren't meant to be all-inclusive. There is an important area or a theme that came out of our conversations, which was the need for and the desire for improvements in the relationship between park owners and residents. We thought about including that and decided as a decision-making principle for the city, it would be difficult because we don't have much ability to influence that. We have a lot of ability to encourage, we can participate in some ways, we can support, but ultimately it's not something that we can control. So I know that there have been suggestions about accountability being a principle. We considered that as well. We had two main reasons for not proposing it. One was that on the one hand, we think anything that is a requirement or is that otherwise is something that people should be held accountable for, that's just a best practice. There shouldn't be requirements that there's no mechanism for keeping people accountable. So it felt more like an obvious feature to include in anything we do. The other was many of the things that could support these principles don't have an accountability feature to them. If we develop a program to help people replace their homes, that's going to be voluntary, almost certainly. It will be probably a financial support and perhaps some negotiations, but there's not really an accountability approach to it. So that was our rationale, and it is something we believe is very important. We just aren't defining it as a principle. So moving on then, we took all the information we gathered, our research, the past actions the city's had, looked at our policies, and then tried to identify actions or areas for further and more in-depth analysis and scoping of potential work plan items. And we landed on these 5 to suggest for your consideration. They, as you'll see in the next few slides, they include multiple options or actions from that list in attachment C. So there is no one-to-one correspondence there. And we did that because there are several paths to accomplish the goals that found in each of these work areas. And we thought that the analysis for those was overlapping, and we would want to investigate multiple ways of accomplishing an outcome. So pad rent stabilization is clearly linked to affordability. It's a principal concern of residents. There are a variety of ways of getting there. Clearly, the infrastructure in the parks, because it delivers vital services to park residents, is of concern, as we've seen recently. It can be very disruptive, and there are many ways of addressing ways of ensuring that those vital services are delivered to community residents, and there are a variety of ways to accomplish that. Energy efficiency is not only consistent with our climate goal and our sustainability goals, but there are significant challenges to doing some of the things that we almost take for granted in our community around that. It's very difficult to do solar photovoltaic in mobile manufactured housing communities, and there are barriers to that we can look at ways the city might be able to help, or others might be able to help address that. And replacement of homes can, not always, but can result in significant energy savings for the individual homeowners as well as the community at large. And as was pointed out in an email to you today, there's part of the analysis of that would be to determine whether that can be accomplished through retrofitting existing homes. We have a little bit of experience with that, but we want to look at that in more depth if this is an area that you direct us to do so.
Did you skip infrastructure?
We can step back if you'd like. So on infrastructure, we identified, or people identified, many ways we could accomplish the goal of ensuring that the infrastructure continues to function well, not only immediately, but as it ages further, gets replaced and upgraded. So there are a variety of paths for doing that. We would like to be able to analyze all of them together and see to what extent each of these paths might make sense. They can work in combination for sure. They can work in combination on some of the other items that we're proposing as well. So, yeah. Go back, please. Go back. Yeah, there we go. One of the things that was identified is that our current mobile home zone and our land use requirements was generated a long time ago and really hasn't been used for a new park yet, and creates some complications for replacing of homes in existing parks. So we want to make sure that our land use code, our zone, and other design guidelines actually supports the outcomes we want. So if we want to have a new park that meets certain goals or new community, let's make sure our zone is something that could be used right off the shelf, so that we don't have to negotiate that as part of creating a new community. So we're proposing to take a look at that. Our zone currently doesn't allow for many housing options in manufactured housing communities. Many people suggested that perhaps it should, and in some cases shouldn't, allow for different kinds of housing. So that's included there as well. And then finally, the fifth area that we are suggesting is licensing, whether you consider it registration or licensing, some way of, as a community, establishing standards, whether it's for infrastructure or various forms of operation, and the relationship between the owner and the tenants or the residents who lease land from that owner. So there are some licensing programs out there at the state level or local level that we could model on, and it's worth investigating, we believe. We also suggest, in looking at the long list of 60-plus actions that people had suggested or we came up with, there are a few that we don't think are really big work efforts that we think with some outreach, with a little more research, we could decide or find out whether they're viable or could move forward. I won't go through them, but they're listed here. The one under the city action that is of particular interest, I think, is a suggested program that would be an alternative. If someone can no longer maintain their residency in a manufactured housing community, rather than using an eviction path, there might be alternatives that would give people more support, help them move more slowly out without creating a financial hardship for the park owner, enable them to have more time to sell their home or relocate it if need be. So that's one we think with a little research we could find a model and see to what extent that would be a good option. And then the resident rights and notification seemed not like it doesn't need a lot of analysis. it's something that we could just move forward on. Timeline, we're looking, we've requested a July time to bring you the fully thought out and prioritized or suggested prioritization of work items and the full scoping of them, following, as you'll see, analysis, another round of communication engagement with all of the stakeholders, and drafting a work product that would go to boards and commissions. We are, we've tentatively proposed going to the Housing Advisory Board, Planning Board, Human Relations Commission, and Youth Opportunities Advisory Board, subject to your desire to hear from those boards, I suppose, since they advise you. So that's our plan from here. We have 4 questions for you. Really, do you have any feedback on what we've presented, what you've read? How do you feel, or what do you think about the decision-making principles and that approach of using those to guide how we move forward? We have a brief summary of the engagement. We plan to use very many of the same tools and the same approach that we've used so far. We're curious to know if you feel like that needs any adjustment. And then lastly, are you supportive of the actions or the work plan, development of work plan items and scoping that we've laid out for you? So with that, I'll open it to questions.
Okay, questions?
So thank you for that. Good presentation. In the memo, it talks about Boulder Meadows being the only one of the 4 that has rental options. Is that right? So what fraction of the pads in Boulder Meadows are rental versus ownership model?
It's approximately 20%.
20% are rental? Okay, thank you. And then I know you went over this at some length, but I was just a little confused about the accountability. So the discussion that you held around that, it seems to me like some of the 5 groups of actions that we're talking about do have a significant accountability component to them that would drive some amount of decision making, such as infrastructure, obviously, or if we do licensing or warrants of serviceability. Any of those seem to me, along with operational things, to have an accountability component to it. So how, again, if you wouldn't mind expanding a little more on why you didn't want to put that in, even though it seems to apply to a few of these.
So I'll point out that one of the things we added was, I believe it was a CAC request, is which would require legal analysis, and you'll see a whole lot of asterisks up there. Part of that is, how do you ensure that we can get the outcome we want with any policy actions that we take? So that is an accountability feature, and that is a lot of that. The legal analysis would be not only how might we get to an outcome, a policy or an ordinance, an agreement, but how would we then have it be enforceable so that the outcome is something that would result from that.
Right. I mean, that's well said. It certainly seems to me like accountability is a big part of, making all of this hang together. So I would just put out there, we can have it for discussion. I just wanted to understand a little better. I certainly think there are uncertainties here, clearly, going forward. But the accountability is, I think, a driving goal of being able to hold the ownership accountable to good, fair service to the community members.
Well, can I just add, maybe improve accountability? I mean, because I do agree with what you said before. I know we're doing questions, but just a thought. Yes, whatever we do should be accountable. It's maybe we are trying to make up for lost ground or whatever in the past. So, questions
sorry.
before we, what?
If I may add, and I think also part of our discussion was with the principles was really trying to boil it down to 3 factors that could apply to all of the things we were proposing across the board. We did definitely bounce accountability off these ideas as we were discussing them, and as Jeff was saying, they are part of the analysis of many of them, but we were really trying to hit on 3 principles that would apply to each of the things we were analyzing. So we will definitely be looking at accountability where it's applicable.
Great. Cindy?
Yes, I was just going to tag on, it's more of a comment to what Sam said, and I'm calling it putting some teeth into it, the accountability thing. And I understand that it doesn't apply to everything, but some things. And I didn't know that the asterisks, I hadn't read the small print below, were all legal analyses, which is great. I mean, that should be very helpful. But one of the things under the affordability, was this increases in operating costs that a manufacturer, or an owner, I should say, might claim for his or her lack of maintenance of infrastructure that has been passed on unfairly to residents. So that's the kind of thing that I think would be really important, again, to tie into this. As I said, more comment.
Well, if nobody has questions, maybe we jump right into, do you have questions? Okay, otherwise, we'll jump into comments since we like those better.
So I have two questions, and one has to do, Jeff, you talked about, I think under our land use code, about barriers to solar PV. Can you go through that a little bit more, or?
I don't have an in-depth understanding of all the barriers. I don't know to what extent they are local versus potentially XL, potentially park owner. So that is part of the analysis we want to do. We have heard from residents in particular that there are significant barriers to doing that. I don't know if my teammates have any better understanding of that or not. It doesn't look like we have in-depth knowledge yet.
But you're going to look into that? That's great.
If that's an area you'd like us to look into, we will spend some time scoping that and see to what extent we can.
I get to put solar panels on my house. It's kind of an equity thing, and so people should be able to put solar panels on their houses, and it really does reduce your outlay of cash, and so it makes a lot of sense, and it's where the city wants people to go. So definitely I want to look at that. And then with respect to the land use code, I think there was, are you talking about like setbacks, anything else, or spacing? I guess we have some spacing requirements that are different that, comport to fire code type regulations.
That's correct, Lisa. So that came up in interviews with staff. I'm trying to think, it may have come up with the interviews with some of the people at Mapleton, with the Mapleton Home Association. And right now, there's just one individual who's a realtor who has used the Board of Zoning Adjustments to be able to put a new home into, at least in the last, 6 years or so, a new home on a pad, which means that there's a level, it takes a level of understanding of how to approach the board in order to get a home replacement. So it feels like an equity issue from what staff is observing.
That would be good. I think, I know at Boulder Meadows at one point they put some rental homes on, and they were smaller than I think the standard product, but I think that was because of our land use codes. So
that's my understanding as well, and I believe the regional manager, Glenn Couch, is here if you'd like to.
Yeah, I said hi to them.
Get more information on that, either in the break or now. So
yeah, no, it was explained to me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, why don't you put the questions up and we will jump right into the meat of it.
Would you like to ask
frozen up.
Mary's questions?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah,
Okay,
so-
yeah, why don't you go ahead and do that?
So I've got Mary's up, or do you want to do it?
I don't know, I had them up, ready to go.
So I think one of the things that Mary requested, and this is probably for Carl to put something out on, was the rental application fee House bill and the local wage option House bill. I would also add that when Aaron and I visited with Casey Becker yesterday, we also heard that one of the things on the table is the longer grace period at eviction. So right now it's 48 hours, and something that I think will be included in those, but we might just check with Carl and get a update to Mary.
If I may?
Yep.
Take them sequentially here. So I did speak with Carl about that. He reminded me that you have a legislative update with him next week where he'll speak to Mary's questions specifically. The bill for considering the local minimum wage was just introduced. So there's and with strong city support, he will be planning to ask you about the rental application fee legislation, which we don't know, haven't looked at it closely enough to know that it even would apply to manufactured housing communities, but certainly to rental product in the city. So you'll be getting a chance to talk about that certainly next week. The 48 hours is referring to the time allowed to remove a home from a park in the event of an eviction, and that is something that, as we pointed out, we are proposing for hopefully legislation this year to extend that to significantly longer, given the financial and logistical barriers of removing a home or selling it.
Yep. Great, and so that was one of hers. I think the only other one that's really a question and not a comment is she made a request about understanding the factors that park owners use in raising rental rates for pads and how that turns into at least maintained, hopefully better service for the residents as far as infrastructure goes. So again, I don't expect you have to answer that now, but she definitely wants to dig into, again, there's a clear difference between the one city managed and owned park and the other three that are for profit as far as rate of increase.
Can I just do a clarification on that? So it's actually a resident managed park. Mapleton is, yeah.
The city owns the land, right, and Thistle and the residents?
Thistle is the owner, and they have a land lease. The Mapleton Home Association has a land lease and an agreement whereby they manage the community.
Great, thanks for the clarification.
Okay.
Continue. She also was in favor of the three principles, but she said an additional principle to consider would be to build on the inherent resilience of these communities. And that's, I think, where people were getting to on accountability. And it seems, and I guess accountability could very easily go under vitality, because if you don't have water, it's really hard for you to get to work in a presentable way. And that's just a simple example.
Okay.
I have.
So wait. Let's go to the questions. Can you put them up there?
Well, wait a minute. I have one more question. More question.
All right. Well, you started giving comments.
And so in the legislative intent, one of the things that came to my attention in speaking with the vice president of Riverstone was that while they put some little notices on residents' doors in both English and Spanish, there was no attempt to put the update of information on people who are living in that house in Spanish. And she gave me a reason which I thought was very implausible, which was that there are too many Spanish dialects. But I guess I'm wondering if there's a way at the local level that we could ask that these basic forms, applications, update forms, things like that, could also be in Spanish. It can't be that hard of an ask. And we have so many people who speak Spanish as their primary language. It should just be a given. And so I'm wondering, could that be done at just the local level, or does that require state? So that's a question.
Off the top of my head, I'd say it could be done at the local level, but I'd want to do a little research to firm that up.
Okay, so I'm just
not aware of any preemption on requiring bilingual, but you never know what's out there until you look.
Okay, so I just think a well-informed community is a happy community, and so if we can have those forms in Spanish, I would like to, at least somebody to look into it. Thank you.
And just to piggyback onto that, maybe that's something that would would be fairly doable as part of a licensing program, but maybe it's something we could just put in an ordinance separate from a licensing structure. So whatever you can give us for the next round would be helpful.
Can I
Because I agree that that's a priority. Yeah.
I agree, more piggybacking. One thing that came out of the recent Riverstone incident was also that there wasn't a uniform, multifaceted way to communicate with everybody. And it was amazing how they didn't have phone numbers, they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have, it was like it never occurred to them. So I guess I would put that not only as part of the thing to research, is maybe that it's both in Spanish, and if there's another major language spoken there, but also that they clarify the mechanisms by which people can expect to be communicated with, be it mobile phone, flyers, whatever, that they'd be much more rigorous. Okay, so it seems like we should go through the actions, but is there any, in the blue questions, just sort of any other input on information that was collected? I think we had some, that doesn't, anybody have any on that? I think the principles we had some thoughts on. So accountability keeps coming up. Do we have, I get that it's embedded. I'm not sure if people want to add it because it keeps coming up. Aaron?
Well, not directly to that, but just in terms of the community engagement, just, we're doing a lot of deep engagement work with Ponderosa, and so hopefully the next phases of this plan will be part of what you engage with them on as you work with them through the other issues that you're talking to them about. Seems like a good opportunity.
Okay, principles?
Yeah, on principles, I mean, I think the three that you have outlined are very important, and they're good touchstones for looking at specific policies. I don't really care if accountability is a separate line item or if it gets embedded explicitly so that it is very clear to the members of the community and to the owners of these facilities that we're going to have some expectations that we're going to continue to advance. I mean, the recent event at Orchard Grove was big enough that we need to be thinking about what that tells us about all of our mobile home parks. And so I think accountability is what the residents are really asking for here, and they're asking for us to dig in. And whether it's licensing, which I think is a very interesting idea, whether it's a warrant of serviceability, whatever penalties that would bring if it was breached, I believe that there are outstanding questions still. And so making it clear to everyone involved that we're taking this quite seriously, I think is the reason why people are asking about the accountability. So however you want to manage it, I don't really care if it's a fourth one or not, just that it's clear that, Vitality requires sewage, water, roads, all of the things that Vitality requires. So anyway, it's not a big point for me how you do it, but I really think people are looking for that.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I think people just feel like, they pay their rent, they pay their mortgage on their homes, they have and should have certain expectations. And if we are not going to hold the managers or the owners accountable, then where are the people supposed to go? And so it doesn't have, I'm like Sam, I'm agnostic as to whether it's a fourth point, but I think it needs to be a significant part. And for me, I would put it in Vitality because it's just
I think I would just add it, frankly.
Yeah.
I feel like we need to send a message both to the residents that we got their backs, and we also kind of need to let the park owners know that, you know what, they need to be more accountable, especially certain ones of them.
Well,
so I would just go ahead and just put it out there so everybody's clear.
I agree, and I think this whole thing of people not being able to contact their council members, we've heard some emails that, different things have occurred, and then they have not, they've been told not to contact council. Again, it's an equity thing. Every resident of this community has a right to contact any member of the city council, and so.
Go ahead.
Point of clarification that it's, the second principle is actually viability as opposed to vitality.
Well, okay, viability, but still, in
But-
order
and it
for it to
still
be
fits,
viable,
yeah.
you
I just
gotta
wanna make
have
sure we-
wash, you gotta
Yep.
flush your toilet.
That's
You
right,
gotta have a
yeah.
clean house.
But it's also about
All
it
part of
being a
viability.
viable business model, which is why I think we need to put accountability in there. We understand that some of these privately owned mobile home parks are supposed to be viable for the owners. I'm sorry, the park owners. So I think accountability is a nice counterweight to that.
And they should be viable for the people who own homes there.
Yeah, but,
So-
okay, I agree. Anything else on principles?
I'm going to jump in and say I agree with Sam and don't think that it needs to be, because it is embedded, that the pieces that have been pursued in here again and again and again are really demonstrate to me, and I really think that the community and the staff has done a really good job of bringing these forward to us so we can see which things need to be done before it goes back to have the prioritization done. That the teeth will be in there if we tackle the right issues so that we don't need to have it called out, and particularly in the ways in which some of these things are introduced. Just my opinion on that.
Others on that one? What?
So I can go over Mary's if we would like to just have comments. I just want the public to be able to hear them. I know that you've received them. One of the important things I think she said is, as priorities are established, it should be taken into consideration that this is about reciprocity and equity. Residents at the various parks pay into water and sewer, yet they do not receive any of the benefits that the rest of the Boulder community sees. So that's just a general comment, I think, about infrastructure as well, and about if there are these 4% annual rate increases on average, what are the residents getting for the extra money that they pay every year?
And can I colloquy on that? And at this point in time, many of the residents can't even see how much water they're actually using. And to be good stewards of the earth, the residents do want to know how much water they are actually using. There's probably a park fee on top of that. But I think we need to get to a point where we can look at meters and how those meters might happen. And we've been talking about this for, I don't know, many years. It's an equity thing. All of us who have apartments or detached houses or condos, we all get a water bill every month, and we know exactly what we've used, and we know where we can cut back or not, so.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, another thing that Mary mentioned is whatever the method used to establish the priorities, it should center the needs of the residents, focusing on life safety, health, and well-being. She's concerned with, I think particularly with the pad rents going up at the rate they are, that there's gentrification and displacement that could be happening as a result of that, and that's something that we should address per se as that. She talks about enforcement, and then she also talks about both the resilience, as Lisa mentioned, but also putting accountability in specifically. And then, so she mentioned, like Lisa, that there are other languages besides Spanish, which maybe need to handle on a case-by-case basis. And then she mentions that the open space master plan micro-engagement approach could be something to look at here. And that's just her thought there. And I think that's it for her list.
So let's just march through each one of the proposed actions and see if we have stuff to add. Okay, on rent stabilization, obviously you have 3 different approaches that need researched. I would say that this is key to affordability and a top priority. I'm guessing everybody agrees. Yep. Is there any other ideas underneath this?
Well, I mean, I think from a legislative agenda standpoint, we may need to bring kind of our particular issues that are related to rent control out specifically. And Tom, this is just a comment for you to think about. It's not clear that the blanket suspension of the rent control preemption is going to go through in that way. And so one thing that we heard was if you have specific asks that are something that the city would like to be able to do along this line, that's not kind of the classic apartment rent control, that we need to bring that forward. So if indeed we do hear that the general rent control preemption bill is not going to pass, I think we need to have 2 or 3 specific asks, this being one of them. Because I think there may be more appetite for that than a generic bill. Aaron, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Sam. So I'll echo that. And, you know, we are just talking about our legislative agenda next week. So I'd have a request to y'all, city staff, if we could get a thought on if there are targeted ways that we could make rent stabilization for mobile home park pads more doable with a change to the state statutes. That would be very helpful to know about. Because Sam and I both heard, you know, the whole repeal may not happen, but maybe there's some openness to targeted things. So that on this topic, I'd really love to hear that. And I'll just throw out while we're talking about it, if we have any other, we have a couple other great ideas of little targeted ways to help with rent stabilization in the city in general. Love to hear your ideas the next week or two.
One thing I'd like to just make clear is we have some examples of things that people have suggested. I don't want you to think that's all we would look at. We tried to frame these as issues or goals we're trying to accomplish. If we can accomplish pad rent stabilization in a way that we haven't heard about yet or that isn't up there, we want to be able to consider. We plan to consider it if you give us the go-ahead on this. So it's also possible that in investigating some of these, they'll drop off. So we want to keep our focus on how do we accomplish a goal, in this case, pad rent stabilization, and there are many ways to do that.
So just to clarify then, you just want to know if we like the 5 that you've outlined and not the sub-bullets or less material? Is that what you're saying?
If you have strong thoughts about them, sure, but generally speaking, we're hoping that you will give us some clear guidance around the goals we're trying to accomplish. And
If we say, yes, all 5 are really important,
Yep.
Is that helpful? Or are we supposed to be picking winners?
if there's one or more that you don't want us to work on or invest more time in, that would be very helpful. If you have a clear sense of priorities amongst yourselves, that would be very helpful as well.
Okay, so we'll answer that one at the end, but meanwhile, let me get...
Well, just following up on that, this rent pad stabilization voluntary by owners doesn't seem to be working. So that one may be one that's already been fully explored, but the second one is something that might have some teeth in it. So in going through these like this, when I looked at it, I thought what could actually make a difference here in what the goals are for the communities. Mm-hmm. So
we've also heard some
generally
interesting ideas from both the management and owners and from the community for incentivizing that stabilization. So there could be a way that we could get to that voluntary piece as well.
That's good to hear. Mm-hmm. Better communication for starters, maybe.
Okay, Aaron and Lisa, whoever was
Just had
next.
a follow-up. Jeff, I appreciate that thought. And in general, I'm happy to have you all go work on this. It's a great list. I just want to make clear that just on the rent stabilization thing, that we have potentially a hot iron right now at the legislature. So there is a timeliness to that bit of it. So just want to make sure we're thinking about that in the short term, not just putting it with everything else.
So just can I confirm that the whole council wants us to work on potential amendments to the rent stabilization bill? Because generally, what we've got from it right now is council's direction to support the bill as it is. And so we generally don't propose amendments, but I've heard from Sam and Aaron that that's something you'd like us to work on
shortly, and if that's the will of the council, we'll certainly do that. And I just wanted to clarify that that's what that is.
So my suggestion, I think Aaron's as well, is this is a Plan B. I mean, I think if we want to support it as is, if it could pass, that would be fantastic, because then all the rest of these things would naturally be allowed. But in the case that it doesn't pass, and you can ask Carl what he thinks the likelihood is, I think it would be great to have not an amendment to, but, language that would replace, essentially.
Right, so and do the rest of you agree with that approach? Okay, so I'll work with Carl during the week and see what we can get done, and we'll certainly have a report for you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
So at the last CMOB meeting that I was at with you guys, Jeff, you proposed something, and maybe it's on the MHC infrastructure, that city ownership of infrastructure might be one thing we could consider in exchange for rent stabilization. So I don't know if you want to expand upon that here.
Certainly, that's an idea that people have been shown a fair amount of interest in, and in a way of linking a couple of things that we feel pretty strongly about. So we would want to definitely invest some time in scoping out what that would look like. Questions of timing and are central to that, as well as what the exchange is.
Right. So I'm interested in that.
Okay, so let's go to the next one. Yeah, infrastructure is another top one, given what we just experienced at Orchard Grove, or more importantly, the residents experienced at Orchard Grove. So I'm thinking that is definitely a top priority. And again, when you mentioned these are all options to explore, and obviously you'd bring back the one that's best.
Or
a
potentially multiple
yeah,
options with the pros and cons and trade-offs for you to consider. And,
Yeah, and I would tag on to what Lisa said and put in metering under this as a possibility, because, if we end up with city ownership of infrastructure, we would potentially have a lot of control over what that looked like.
Yeah, and I guess this is a question, but I mean, it's been said, but I guess I want to underscore it. Everybody that lives in the city is entitled to some basic infrastructure services being provided, like water and sewer. And if somebody is, like a park owner is tasked with that and fails, there has got to be some mechanism to ensure that happens, or that they pay us and we do it for them, or whatever. But I guess that's the accountability piece. But it strikes me that surely they are obligated to meet those basic services. Otherwise, somebody else will do it for them. And they'll have to, yeah.
Just like snow shoveling, if you don't shovel, the city comes in and does it, and then you pay.
Yeah, it's a big abatement.
Yeah. It's just a really big abatement this time.
Okay. So anything else about infrastructure other than it's really important? Okay. Energy efficiency. So I guess I would say, yeah, that's important to us. I think, well, it is important. I think we need to get basic services. I mean, if we have to choose, I don't think we have to choose, but if we had to choose, first, let's make sure that basic infrastructure is taken care of. But I would like the same options for sustainability to be available to everybody that lives in our community, whether you live in a manufactured home or not. So in that sense, it should be, I think, equally available.
I would just add water efficiency to this, because whether the pipes are leaky and residents are being, apportioned a pro rata share for leaky pipes, or, we would like ways to encourage the residents to know what their actual water use is, and to reduce it to the extent they can, and to pay fairly for what they're using. So I would just put that here as well, because that's a way to tie that in. For my opinion, the first, second, and fifth are potentially the most important because they implicate, like Suzanne said, basic services. And 5 is maybe a way of getting at those basic services and requiring them in certain ways. I think energy efficiency is obviously important. It's near and dear to my heart, but it also isn't as important as water and sewer necessarily in the short term. So I would prioritize those first. Same with the land use code. I don't really know what you're thinking completely there. I mean, I've heard setbacks and spacing and so on. But again, I think while that's important, that the basic services and making sure that we have hooks into that are more important. So I would say 1, 2, and 5 are at the top of my list, and 3 and 4 are kind of second.
And I would agree with that, except for to the extent if 4 is preventing us from doing 1, 2, or 5, then obviously we should get to it sooner rather than later.
And I think, I mean, when you look at the Boulder Valley Comp Plan, and we've passed it several times, we say we want new mobile home parks. And so those new mobile home parks, I think we need to look at, well, what would the land use be? Would we have a foundation? Could we have a manufactured home that's stick built that would be easily put on a frame? I think there were some concerns from people, and I share those, about having to have their homes replaced if they're pre-1976. I've been in some of the pre-1976 homes, and some of the people have really made them very, very, very nice. And so I wouldn't want to move out of that. But
any other thoughts? Is everybody agreeing with Sam on 1, 2, 5? Okay, Aaron, sorry.
Just one more additional thought. I mean, I agree with the basic prioritization, but it seems like there's potentially some easy stuff like energy efficiency. If there's some easy roadblocks to overcome with PV solar, for example, may as well get those done. So I understand we'd keep them all on the list, but and then just that interplay of energy efficiency and permanent foundations, which we don't allow currently, and how different kinds of manufactured homes going forward, particularly if we were exploring new parks, might interact with energy efficiency in that kind of way. So it would be again, lower priority than making sure that the current parks are safe and have good infrastructure, but I think intriguing to explore.
And one of the things that came up in my discussion with Ms. Jurgis was that we talked about skirts, and we talked about energy efficiency of the skirts and stuff like that. And she said that when there become holes or drafts are in there, then they affect the pipes. And so I guess I'd be very much interested in looking at how do we help people with skirts, or do we do that? I used to live in a mobile home in Idaho that they used straw bale around the base, and and around the house, and it really made it much more energy efficient. But you know, the thing is we need to make sure that whatever infrastructure is exposed isn't exposed to the elements.
Okay, anything more about land use codes? Anything else? Okay. So mostly I think we're agreeing with you. Are there any other specific questions you have that you'd like us to hold forth on?
I think
So the issue of parks, new parks came up, and then being landlocked and limited. And I would be remiss if I didn't bring up my favorite topic, or one of them, which is putting a mobile home park eventually on our municipal airport that serves less than 200 people. We could serve a lot more people making a new mobile home park at least some of our land at the airport. And I won't be here when you get to talk about it for the next comp plan, but I really hope you do remember that. And it's in Area 1. I think our airport is 130 some acres, and certainly we should be able to carve out some of that for a really nice manufactured home community.
I think you have answered our questions well and given us good guidance. If the timeline, and if there are no comments about the timeline, that's the time we'll have. We'll have the staff resources we have, and we will prioritize developing more thoroughly the items around pad rent stabilization, infrastructure, and licensing than the other two with the time we have available, but you'll still get an analysis of those.
And just to clarify, you'll be coming back in the summer to actually, with actionable proposals?
So our intent is to take each of these, to do some more work with other staff and other experts to try and scope out what it would take to identify which options have the most promise, what the pros and cons might be, and then bring them to you in July at this time is what we have scheduled to get your direction on which to turn into actionable work items and move forward onto our work plans.
Okay, so then I guess that prompts a question. Like, if we said, yeah, let's figure out licensing, when would be the soonest we would see ordinance language?
It will depend on what we find in terms of our legal analysis, what our constraints might be, what other models we can pluck off the shelf and turn into something actionable. That's work that is what we intend to do over the next couple of months and then get community input on that.
Okay, well, do you think, I guess, I'm just pushing you a little bit, I appreciate, do you think we'll get to ordinance language on any of these this council?
I hesitate to say. I don't know, not knowing the legal issues, unless Tom has some thoughts on that. We can always try and advance something and with the amount of research we're able to do, but.
I think there's a good chance we'll get to some of this with this council, Suzanne.
Ooh, yes. Okay.
I can't promise all of the harder stuff, but several of the things you suggested were not heavy lifts. And so to answer your question, we'll try to get some of it done. Just tell us what you want and we can do it.
Well, they're going to come back in July, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we can go from there, and maybe at our July meeting, you might have a couple ordinances prepared that we might be able to take on.
We could certainly work on that.
No, and that would be greatly appreciated.
I, for one, would find that very satisfying.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And if you do find that some of these are easy lists and we can fit them in as we go, then that feels all right too.
Yep.
I think.
But I do want to say thank you so much for the work you've done on this, and I feel like the materials presented tonight and prepared for tonight were just outstanding. Yes. And I just want to thank you, and I want to thank the community out there and the mobile home park owners who have participated in a constructive way. And let's just keep the dialogue going. And we can't do what we do without your involvement, so keep it up. And thank you for all your involvement.
Well said. Aaron?
Yeah, I'll second that. Thank you to the mobile home park residents. Thanks so much for your constructive involvement and for being here and being so engaged. And I also want to give a shout out to the folks at the Sustainable Community Development Clinic at CU Law. The policy analysis was really helpful. And I was actually meeting with them this morning on some different topics around affordable housing and homelessness. I was very impressed with their dedication and knowledge and hardworking attitude. So thanks so much for the work you've done on that.
It's just
Good
hire those
lawyers.
guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And thanks to staff. Yeah, I know this is a big priority.
And
all of
thanks to Boulder Meadows owners for coming and managers. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay then.
I'm happy for somebody else to decide it. Right. I don't want to be king of the world, but I'm happy to have CAC decide. I'm pretty delegated, but I just want to be involved. It's not like I'm not doing it. We're doing it for fun. The problem is that somebody works on a question, we're stuck with that question.
I know, for dozens of people, right? Yeah, lots of people.
Maybe I'll just, you want to see it, right?
Hey, you guys come back soon. We'll get this show on the road.
I have to admit, I don't understand why it's contradictory. Yeah.
So,
Right.
yeah, I would.
Did the city attorney say it was contradictory? Right, yeah.
Wait, I could just, I don't think we.
Hi, Kurt.
So where's our chair? He said he'd meet me in an hour. I thought I would still tell you. Okay.
Out of all the people that could be missing, I wasn't expecting him.
Well, the track is like, I know you're here. Yes.
The green dot is here. Lindsay's here.
Well, let's have a seat.
Coming.
Thank you.
But
We're missing Nikhil.
I know, it's really surprising.
Yes, it is before gender puts blank. But then the very first thing is going to be voting.
Okay, great.
Should we text him?
It's funny how many people have called me to ask for, state legislators have called me to ask for input on 1057. Chris Hansen.
Which one?
Chris Hansen's book, securitization.
Oh, okay. On
Frito? One, I just want one.
Are you guys ready? And we're starting with
Vote 16, right?
vote 16, so we can go ahead, right? Okay, everybody, we're going to reconvene now and start with the Human Relations Commission's series of topics.
So good evening. Again, I'm Kurt Fernhauer, Director of Housing and Human Services. So this evening, we're going to be talking about 3 items. And just to give you, I'll do a little brief on what that structure will look like. So we will start off with a brief presentation. We'll have some input from the Human Relations Commission person who's been related to that or put some additional effort into those items, and then we'll have the discussion. So there's basically 3 sections that we'll be going through. So tonight, Clay Fong is our staff member leading our presentations on all three. Lindsay Loberg has joined me, and Nikhil Mankakar. I'm not sure where he is. But
He'll be with me in a minute.
okay, but we are starting a little bit earlier than we thought, so I think he'll be joining us shortly.
Okay.
Nope.
There's actually a button. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Clay Fong. As Kurt has indicated, I'm the manager of community relations in the Office of Human Rights. As Kurt indicated, we'll be doing almost like 3 mini study sessions tonight, the first on voting initiatives, the second on hate crime sentence enhancement, and the final on gender-inclusive language revisions. So that's sort of self-explanatory. On the first topic, on the issues relating to voting, the first question for council is, does City Council wish to move forward with referring voting by 16 and 17-year-olds in municipal elections as a 2019 ballot initiative, absent a citizen-led initiatives? The second question, which is quite similar, is, does City Council wish to move forward with referring voting by non-citizens in municipal elections as a 2019 ballot issue, absent a citizen-led initiative? We can just see what the brief outline of the discussion looks like tonight. So we'll start with the vote 16 piece, and as some of you may be familiar with, this part of this originated with YOAB, the Youth Opportunities Advisory Board. And in terms of analysis, and this has happened in a few other jurisdictions, there's some reasonably compelling reasons to extend the voting franchise to younger people. One is that you're essentially building a foundation for more civic participation by getting people started more young, and there is some data to indicate potentially that there's a longer-term increase in voter turnout. The other piece, too, is that 16 and 17-year-olds are impacted by local policies, maybe more than somebody younger. They're at an age where they might start driving, decisions made regarding education, public welfare, et cetera, start to have more of an impact than, it might have on them if they were younger people. Another interesting piece, and I suppose this goes a little bit to sort of brain development issues and what have you, is that the body of evidence indicates that individuals in this age group are equivalent to 18-year-olds in relevant capacities. So decision-making, analytical skills, and the like are all comparable to those that currently enjoy the benefits of being able to vote. We've had some municipalities, Tacoma Park and Hyattsville, Maryland, and you'll be hearing about those municipalities again a little bit later. They have adopted this, and what they have found is they found, higher level of civic engagement amongst young people, and, in things like civics classes, they're seeing folks are more engaged because they have a real stake. It's no longer an abstract issue. They're also seeing more engagement on the part of some political candidates and people bringing forward certain issues with young people. So there's really a greater sense of sort of public engagement with young people that are allowed to vote. So, and this is a little bit challenging in some ways because, currently, as we are, my current understanding right now is that, until City Council decides to move forward on this, we're not to expend much in, okay. Sorry. No problem. We're not to expend sort of city resources on looking into this further until, we get the green light from City Council. And, one of the issues that we have not been able to look at are what are the real costs and resources involved in making this into a reality. So if you decide to move forward with this, that is something that we would need to assess. To make this work, we've identified 3 options to move this forward. One is working with the Boulder County Clerk and Recorder's Office to allow younger City of Boulder residents to vote on a city ballot. One reason for doing that is that there is a statewide election system, and we would somehow need to have some access to that in terms of the registration piece. And then I've recently learned, too, that we would not be able to have access to that unless we also had permission from the Secretary of State to do so. So that would be part of the issues with that. The other would be that the City of Boulder would run its own election for young voters, sort of independent of everything else. Again, we don't know what the resources involved would be for that, so that's another unknown. The last plausible option is to explore with other cities in Boulder County the possibility of doing the expansion of the franchise county-wide. So we would have to partner up with all the other jurisdictions in the county to move forward. Somewhat similar analysis exists when we start looking at the issues of non-citizen voting. Like young people, non-citizens do have a stake in local policies, and decisions made through a democratic process can have a very real impact on them. The second point, which kind of reminds me of some of the Schoolhouse Rock kind of stuff, is, non-citizens pay taxes but are unrepresented and can't vote. So, some may say this raises a question of, representation and taxation. Again, we've seen that there are some municipalities, and those are those two municipalities that we had earlier mentioned in Maryland, that have extended the franchise to non-citizens. But, and I think this is a very important caveat, it's been brought to our attention that when you apply for citizenship in the United States, there's a questionnaire, and one of the questions on the questionnaire is, have you been registered to vote? And this creates a potentially vulnerable position for people who have done so. So this is a detail that would certainly have to be addressed. It's a pretty pressing detail, so that if someone answered in the affirmative and was voting in a Boulder municipal election, this would not somehow get them under the radar of ICE and subject them to difficulties in applying for citizenship or criminal penalties. So I think that would be the major concern around this particular piece, and we would need to figure that out. So we return to those basic questions, and I think at this point, we should be open for discussion at this point? Okay.
Do we want to hear from the commissioner first?
The commissioners are not creating input on this. It's the other two items.
Oh, okay. All right, well, I got some questions. Yeah.
Well, I'm interested in seeing this. I think the process of having a citizen-led initiative is actually a better one, because it's a platform to educate the community about it, to have dialogue about the issues, and I think people are more involved, so that when the ballot initiative appears on the ballot, people are more informed in terms of their voting for it.
So I got you next. I guess, to me, the question is, what is the citizen engagement like? Is there a group championing this? Is Yoab, well, for either of the two efforts, who's gung-ho about this?
So my understanding, and this is prior to my time taking this position, is that when this was originally brought up about a year ago, there were some groups that had expressed some grassroots interest in that. Since then, though, we've not seen anybody reach out to the Human Relations Commission, at least, so it's hard for me to gauge exactly who is motivated around this.
Okay, we have a queue. We have Bob. I don't know if we're... Okay.
I had just two questions, actually, for Tom, I think. Tom, can you remind us again, if you know off the top of your head, we changed recently the rules, or maybe Lynette knows this, the rules for number of signatures on a petition, and also when the deadline is for submission of a residence petition to get on the ballot. Lynette, do you know those?
So I know to turn in a charter change amendment, that did not change. That's August 7th.
Okay, and these are charter changes?
Yeah, it would be.
August 7th, okay. And did you know the number? We changed the calculation of the number, right?
We changed it for municipal initiatives. I'll check on the charter one. I don't think we changed it, so it's probably around, was it 4,500? I think around 4,500.
That's good enough. Okay, thank you.
I have a couple more questions before we get to comments. Golden recently had this on their ballot. Can we talk a little bit about their experience, and had they worked out any of the questions on, like, how are they going to do it with their county and so on?
Some of those specifics we don't have the information on, but we can certainly find out. But what I've been led to understand is that it was not as much of a citizen-led process as it could have been. I mean, council had embraced it, but I understand that there are very little resources and very little public engagement. And it's arguable that the lack of public engagement didn't do the success of the initiative any favors.
And then the other thing is, do we have any sense for either of them, the number of eligible voters that we would anticipate, which I think is related to the costs and also the logistical hurdles?
We would also need to research that.
Okay, we don't know.
Yep.
Yeah, you asked us that on Monday. We weren't able to get to that.
Okay.
Yep.
I guess I feel like I'm monopolizing it. I guess one other question is on the non-citizen voting. Obviously, protecting the data of people that chose to give it to us would be paramount. I guess what guarantees if any, do we have that we can do that? And do we know what Tacoma Park and Hyattsville were able to do?
A little bit. So we don't think we can protect it. Voting records are under state law considered public records, and there's really no exemption that we can think of under CORA that would protect them. What I read was, I think it was San Francisco. San Francisco also extended non-citizen voting for school boards, and they say that the people who vote tend to be legal residents and not people who are completely undocumented. So they don't expect them to participate, and they just accept that. So they are extending the franchise to some segment of the people who are non-citizens, but not to all.
Like green card holders or?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have knowledge of this question? You need a. You got to push.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I don't know about the Vote 16, but on the non-citizen voting, there is a community group, the Coalition to Expand Voting Rights, that brought this forth to the Commission and City last year, has continued going, and I've been meeting with them every other week or so, and they have been looking into addressing these issues with some national lawyers, and have also been building out the coalition to include people from, say, League of Women Voters and other groups. So I just want to specify there is an active group around this, and they will be sending an update to the council. I just talked to them today, sometime next month, on what they plan to do, but they're looking at both 2019 and 2020 as a potential to collect signatures and bring it forth.
Hey, can you introduce yourself?
So I'm Nikhil Mankekar. I'm the chair of the city's Human Relations Commission.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, Clay, you mentioned that for the Vote 16, that one of the options would be to get other cities in the county as well. But sort of to eliminate the difficulty of the city versus county level voting, we probably have to get like absolutely every city plus the county to pass that simultaneously. Otherwise, you still have the same kind of fundamental difficulty.
I think that's a correct assessment.
Yeah, which would be tough.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Question?
It's not a question. I was just going to read Mary's comment. Okay, you want it? Okay, so Mary said, my support for a citizen-led ballot initiative is based on observations and personal experience that they build community, promote movement building, enhance critical thinking, create connection, solidarity, and accountability. The process also cultivates leadership and power is not zero-sum. In short, democracy is practiced. For all these reasons, I do not support a council-led initiative on either of these proposals.
Okay. All right.
She also adds that she believes that at least some subgroup here is planning a citizen-led initiative.
On which one?
She doesn't, I think it's non-citizen voting. So I'll just jump in with my comments. Bob and I just met with some members of YOAB before this meeting, and it seems like they're still interested in pursuing this for the Vote 16. It wasn't clear to me whether they were ready yet or not. In other words, fully organized enough to be doing a campaign on this. But I agree with Mary that these are both going to be controversial enough in certain ways that having, the socialization piece is important. What I've heard about the Golden situation was that didn't happen very well, and I think it went down something like 2-1. And so it was just put forward by a council and then not supported with signature gathering campaign, which will serve to both educate people who haven't thought through some of these issues. They will need to be able to address those with people, letter writing campaigns, and so on. So I tend to think that these could be pretty worthy, but I think they're going to need, kind of a groundswell of support. And so if there are people willing to run something this year and gather signatures this year, I think that's the right way to go about it, because the signature gathering and the coalition building really will serve to elevate it in people's consciousness. So I'm not particularly interested in council putting this forward.
Yeah, and I would just add to Sam's thing, I was on council when those initiatives were put on and they lost. And there was a lot of anger. Well, one, it was to put voting, non-citizen residents on our boards. That was the issue. And so it went up once, and then it was voted down, and then a couple years later, it came back, and I think there was much more public discussion about it. It did pass, but since we've passed it, we have yet to, I think we did it for one individual, and that individual declined to serve on the board, which we, yeah.
No,
Well,
we had,
Somebody serve.
we had some of
yeah, but the other, it was that we have had one person who has been, two people actually, who have been not documented and who have served on our, but when we did that ballot issue, it was of the concern that this person, this individual had applied who was an undocumented resident, and he wanted to be on one of our boards, and then the year cycle went and he didn't reapply. Something had happened. And so anyway, all I'm saying is that I think it needs to have more public discussion, and the way you do that is by doing petitions.
I'm with the group as far as I'd rather have each of these brought forward with a residents initiative. It sounds like there's a group forming at least on one. New Era might be another group that might support this. I don't want to tell anybody how to organize themselves, but it does sound like there's a little bit of work to do, because these groups could come to you and say, geez, there's some issues. We heard it at the study session. Can you help us with the issues? And so I'd like to, if council agrees, instruct staff to be supportive and helpful and do the legal research and the other work that might be necessary within reason to help these groups, because I wouldn't want these groups to go out there, just pull a petition, get 4,500 signatures, and find out there's a really big problem. So to the extent that there are issues or problems, or maybe there's ways to do this that gets around some of these problems, to guide these groups so that their path forward is logical, and we don't run into a problem in November. We know what the issues are in May or June or July as they're putting this together and collecting signatures. So I'd like to, if council agrees, I'd like to instruct staff to be supportive of a residents initiative.
So I assume that you want us to support a group that would come to us and seek that
information or legal research. Some of the issues you identified, which are not bottomed out yet.
Right.
I'm not suggesting you have to go out and figure those out, because if no one shows up at your doorstep, no sense in spending the time. But if a group comes to you and asks for some help on sorting through some of these issues, I guess I'd like to suggest, within reason, that staff and our legal team be helpful, supportive of that.
That's the clarification I was asking.
well, can I ask another question related to that, though? Is there a recommendation from the commission? I mean, is HRC fired up to do one of these, or both of these, or they're just saying, hey, what do we think? I guess, because anyhow, to me, that's also about, if it's not a priority for HRC, anyhow, let's keep going down and hear from more people, and then we'll try to conclude where we're at.
Well, I have a colloquy question.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, on Bob's. So isn't the normal process that when somebody brings us a proposed initiative to carry, that you give feedback to that?
Yes.
Yes, and so it would be, I think, expected that we would provide that level of support. So I agree with you, but I also agree that doing the work ahead of time doesn't seem to make sense.
So Sam, to clarify though, what I heard Bob and Kurt say was the issues such as how we would go about conducting an election, or what are the potential obstacles if this comes forward. What I'm hearing is you want us to explore that and maybe give, as he said, bottom out those issues before, so that people aren't discovering those in November. And so that's your understanding. So, like, contact the county clerk and see what's possible, or put some numbers on what it would cost for the city to run an election.
Yeah, I mean, I guess.
Can I jump in here? Sure. I happened to see Hillary Hall, and so I said, hey, by the way, we're doing this. Do you have any thoughts about this? More like, what would be the logistical challenges? And then she started going, well, okay, think about how many ballots we have to do when you have a special district within your larger city, within your larger county, within your larger state, or we have legislators, half of Boulder is represented by ED and the other half by Casey, for example. Anyhow, you have to end up printing each new ballots. Anyhow, so it gets logistically more complicated. So anyhow, but I do think at least a preliminary conversation just to kind of get the sense of what we'd be talking about. It also is related to the number of voters. So anyhow, we could at least do that to better farm out the playing field. I guess I would also say, I would like to know real quickly about if we cannot protect people's information, that needs to be known from the get-go. And so then this becomes about having green card holders vote. And is that motivating to people enough to do this? I guess I would like us to define the playing field a little bit. Forget who I interrupted. Aaron.
Yeah, so I'm supportive of these ideas. You know, just say I have a nearly 16-year-old son who I think would make a fantastic voter. And I also think that having all of our adult residents be able to vote would be a fair thing. So I'm supportive of these ideas. I agree with my colleagues that I'd love to see a citizen-initiated process. And then to colloquy a little bit about how that might look. I mean, I think the feedback that Bob gave is not go out and do all this research on your own. But I think it's to do more than just the level that we would normally do. Somebody brings in a potential petition and we answer, well, here's the kind of language you'd have to do, here's the steps you'd follow. But I think to go past that and instead say, well, there's some complexities to these, and to ask you if citizen groups do come forward with these ideas and are trying to work on them, to assist them with some staff time on some research on how those things might end up working out. So that's what I was hearing, and that I would definitely support that, a little bit of additional staff support if those groups come forward.
Does that sound right to people?
It sounds right to me.
Yeah, I guess I would just say we should offer an invitation to the people who might do either one of these to begin an engagement with staff as soon as they think they're really going to move it forward, because staff can at least tell them, here's the identified issues, how do you want to deal with them? They may have their own opinions, for instance, about the protection of information. And so I'd be happy to...
Differ from Tom?
No, whether they would want to carry it forward in light of that information. So I mean, I think they would have strategic decisions that they would want to flesh out. Staff could help them identify the issues, but they might, you know, they're the ones carrying the petitions. They're the ones that are probably going to have to figure out what makes sense.
Okay.
I just think, so we just asked housing staff and this guy who's still here to put something together for July so we could try and finish some ordinances. I'm fine with that, but I think we need to be sure how much time goes into it.
Fair enough. Okay, so let me sum up what I think I hear. Well, and I would agree with Aaron. I think both of these are laudable concepts. And I especially think the 16 to 17-year-old one, I think teaching people to be engaged citizens or residents who vote is a very useful thing. And I think when you're in high school, the place where you live growing up is where you tend to plug in, and less so when you go away to college because you're kind of distracted. Okay, so what I'm hearing is there's interested in the concepts. We'd prefer a citizen-led initiative, and to the extent that one emerges, or if the folks listening here say, yes, we are ready, a certain amount of staff time, but given other priorities. And I would expect the HRC to also, presumably you have priorities and you can help with the that effort. So, does that sum up? Is that good enough? Okay.
Okay, so this takes us to our second topic, which is hate crime sentence enhancement. We'll be following kind of a similar structure to the previous piece. So we'll be looking at analysis, summary of community engagement, next steps, and then looking at, again, the questions presented to council with respect to this. So this is kind of a high-level overview. we haven't looked at this for a while, and we believe that there are reasons to revisit Boulder's hate crimes approach. A lot of that is based on feedback from the process of public engagement around diversity and inclusivity in Boulder from 2016 to 2018. That includes what's been captured in the Community Perceptions Assessment Study, the CPA Open House event in 2017. There was an HRC public hearing on racial bias and hate incidents a little bit about a year ago, and other folks coming before the HRC, and I understand in some instances council. I feel very strange quoting somebody who's sitting down the table from me, so Nikhil, maybe if you want to just expand on what you've said, or just a brief.
Well, I won't go ahead and read the quote, but I do think why we should strengthen the municipal ordinance is because of some of the difficulties we have in prosecuting hate crimes. One is that at the state level, based on the past state legislatures and I think nationally, it's difficult to get the strongest and most effective hate crime laws passed at the state level, and within our own, we also have some gaps as well, so hence we have the mixed motive and religious bias protections in this, included in this, that are not covered under state law. Additionally, while federal law is quite good, you have to have a violation of the Interstate Commerce Clause, and there's some legal reasons that make federal law difficult to apply at state level. So, for instance, like the South Carolina church shooting, there's difficulty in the feds coming in and doing something about that. So, again, it goes back to a lot of what we've been doing around being conscious and doing the best we can and acting at a local level to address the national rise in hate and issues that maybe we have difficulty at the state and national level doing.
Thank you. So we're going to look at two areas that we feel are most appropriate for expanded protection. One is that pertaining to mixed motive, and the other is that pertaining to religious practice. And Nikhil and I have been working very closely on these issues, and he's taken a bit of a leadership role in helping us to identify some of these issues and what some of the possible solutions are. So mixed motive. An example of a mixed motive hate incident might be your classic fender bender in the parking lot. People crash into each other. Nobody knows what who the other person is. They get out of the car. It escalates into an assault. And then in the course of it, it takes on a racially charged nature. Racial epithets are thrown about. That's sort of a classic example. Somebody gets hurt. Somebody gets arrested. The problem with that we found in other jurisdictions is that it can be very problematic to charge something as a hate crime if there are other motives involved, so the mixed motive piece. And that the workaround with that, and we've seen this in a lot of state laws, Illinois being most notable, and we'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily, where both the case law and explicit statute says that mixed motive crimes, you can still pursue them as a hate crime in addition to the underlying crime. And, locally what we're looking at, because we're not talking about state law, we're talking about municipal law, so we'd be looking at things like lower level assaults, the lower degree of assault, vandalism, et cetera. We aren't necessarily going to be getting into things like murder or, the much more serious crimes that are going to be charged out by the DA. Nevertheless, I think that it's important, and I think this is the view of the HRC as well, that essentially hate crimes laws aren't just about penalizing the behavior that underlies a hate offense, but they are also about sending a message to vulnerable folks in the community that there is a degree of protection and a recognition of their vulnerability. And I think that's very important, especially, and I think many will argue that in the last few years, as certain sort of behaviors become more normalized, and I think that's to the detriment, the need for such enhancements becomes increasingly necessary. So a good example of this, and this may seem a little sort of time travelist, this quote actually comes from a report that covers the year 2002, but it actually was published after 2002, as these government reports tend to be, and it actually refers to a 2003 state statute in Illinois. And essentially the quote says that, we now kind of have a conclusive guidance with respect to saying if there is a mixed motive, this can still be pursued as a hate crime. So, I think that sort of sums up the mixed motive piece. I mean, it's a relatively simple piece, but I think because of some of the challenges that are faced where you don't have explicit language allowing for mixed motive charges, it's an important piece to pursue. Next up is religious practice. And again, HRC, the Human Relations Commission, has received feedback about incidents involving individuals practicing their religious beliefs. And when we talk about religious practice, we're not talking just about, people in a church, but people that might be engaged in individual prayer in a house of worship, outside of a house of worship, a student on campus or somebody in a public space, in a park or something like that. So that's really what we're trying to provide here. We have some good guidance at both the federal and state level, and I believe that our current district attorney, who had experience in New York State as prosecutor in New York City, has pointed us to the New York State misdemeanor language as a worthwhile starting point. It may not be enough to simply make some of those changes with respect to the language ordinance with sentence enhancements without also looking at some other pieces of the puzzle here. One would be that when we look at who's currently protected under hate crimes ordinances, those don't necessarily line up with the protected classes identified in the human rights ordinance. So it would be worthwhile to make sure that there's some consistency in that. The other piece, which is related more to a policy piece, is really working with the police and helping to sort of boost the training on hate crimes and investigation, because these do have some special sensitivities that may be absent from other types of offenses. Another piece to consider is that of looking at housing status as a protected class that could also be covered under a hate crime sentence enhancement piece. So adding, the folks that are unhoused as part of that protection, because certainly we have seen attacks on folks in that population. Last but not least is the potential to encourage additional use of restorative justice as an option for offender dialogue. Of course, we have to be careful that we're not creating a dynamic where victims are being re-victimized, but in cases where things may be a bit more gray, taking advantage of an opportunity to create a meaningful dialogue might be one of the more constructive things that we elect to do in dealing with these types of issues. With respect to community engagement, and perhaps this is a bit of a repeat of some earlier points, there's been a lot done in the last few years, and the reason why we're emphasizing that point is we have to recognize the possibility of feedback fatigue. Commissioner Mankakar has pointed out to me that, a lot of folks have been engaged on this issue, and we don't want to sort of have them come to the table yet again when they feel that they've kind of adequately said their piece with respect to their concerns about these issues. Nevertheless, with respect to community engagement, options would include a hearing at HRC or perhaps some other sort of hearing or public outreach event. If council decides to move forward on this, here's just a bit of a timeline on how we might want to work with this. We can see it sort of has the steps of the city attorney's office working on fine-tuning and developing language, potential for public hearing, a final sort of review, and then ultimately it would come back before city council for their consideration. So these are the council questions. The first being essentially to direct staff to, address the issues of mixed motive and religious expression, and to also select which of the policy recommendations would the city council wish to pursue. Okay, so to summarize, and again, out of respect for his work on this, Commissioner Mankakar, do you have any sort of concluding statements on this topic?
Just a couple things I'll add. When we look at the municipal level, as Clay had mentioned, those would be lower level crimes and assaults and cases of harassment. But nevertheless, it's important not to discount, minimize, or rationalize those in any way. So, for instance, a lot of this came out of feedback that the commission got, say, on Muslim students at CU and some having head coverings torn off and being called racial epithets. Now, that would not be an assault that put someone in the hospital, but that could be classified as a simple assault that could go to the municipal court. And this could, these changes could enhance those, the ability to charge those as a hate crime with the religious protections, and then also the mixed motive piece in case that came into play as a defense. The other thing that mixed motive pieces could also cover that you should know about is, say, attacks on GLBT communities, and a common defense is used as like a gay panic defense, where if someone, say, hit on someone who was straight, who then assaulted them or something, using that as a defense, I mean, it's ugly, but that's been used in cases nationally, and I think the mixed motive piece could go some way in terms of providing additional protections under the law to victims in those instances. Besides that, the only thing I have to add is I appreciate that the council, Tom, Jane, and your office have all been really supportive, and the commission staff and my fellow commissioners in taking this law up. It means a lot to me personally, after hearing a lot of feedback that the commission got over my whole time on the commission and all of these diversity studies. Every time hate crimes came up, it stung me quite a bit due to my own personal experiences. Due to some of my own personal experiences with this, and knowing what victims go through in the system and what kind of defenses get used and what can happen to you. And so, over the past decade of my life, I've devoted myself to assisting victims and trying to find ways to improve this. And while we have a very good law on the books in Boulder that was passed, I think we found some loopholes that could, I know, personally would change some people's lives for the better. So I thank you for taking this seriously and the consideration you give tonight.
Thanks. Okay, questions? Sam?
A quick question on the restorative justice piece. I can see that being something that cuts both ways, where it could be good in certain cases and not so good for the victim in other cases. Have you talked to the municipal judge about this component? What kind of digging have you done into how she would handle it if this were something that were brought forward?
Well, I have to confess, in my previous position with the city, I was running the mediation program and the restorative justice program. So personally, I've been working with the municipal courts on this stuff for over 10 years. I think there is a greater level of sensitivity, and I think we would need to develop new guidelines with respect to these types of crimes versus your sort of typical disorderly conduct kind of charge. And I think that, this is a conversation that would need to take place. I think the main safeguards I would be concerned about is really protecting the victims. And one way that we've addressed that in the past is sometimes you may have a surrogate victim, or for example, you might have somebody from the HRC acting as a voice of an impacted community versus the actual victim themselves, or even a representative from an organization such as the Anti-Defamation League. I certainly share those concerns, because really, to me, the cardinal sin, if you will, of restorative justice is to cause harm to the victim.
Okay. Well, Tom's trying to get in here. Were you on restorative justice?
I wanted to sort of talk about this on a higher level a little bit and give some feedback from my perspective as the chief prosecutor, if I could.
Yep.
So I'm really excited about this opportunity to work on the hate crimes ordinance. I think that there are some challenges with the ordinances that this gives us an opportunity to fix. The sentence enhancement right now increases the maximum fine from $1,000 to $2,000. We very rarely get the maximum fine in anything anyway, so it's not a substantial impact. I agree completely with Clay that assuring our community that we're protecting them is really important, but I think there are better ways that we can approach this that we should explore. First of all, fines are by their nature regressive. Rich people have a much better ability to pay a fine than a poor person, and has greater impact on a poor person than a rich person. Restorative justice is one form of things that people are doing in the courts to change behavior more effectively. So I'd like to expand this discussion a little bit to see how we can make the existing ordinance more effective to protect people, including perhaps a mandatory educational component for defendants, not just working with the victims, but understanding the true nature of their crime and the effect on the community that goes beyond that.
that one of the challenges in the current ordinance is to get that sentence enhancement, we have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person's intent was bias. That's a very difficult standard to meet, and for right now, not a large benefit in terms of sanctions. So I would like to consider doing this in an alternative way where we look at maybe we don't increase the sanction, but require mandatory education and don't require proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but require it as an optional sentencing enhancement for the judge, so that we could do more of these. One of my frustrations is we don't do very many of these because they are incredibly hard to prove, and you're taking on a burden that may ultimately make it harder to prove the underlying crime. So I think that this is really great work. I appreciate what the HRC has done. I'd like the permission of the council to take this a little bit further. I certainly think the enhancements that Nikhil has talked about are great, and I think we can incorporate those pretty easily. But I think we can make this ordinance a much better ordinance and much more useful to our community and protective of our community if we look at some other things that are going on in the criminal justice system today that work more effectively to change behavior than just increasing the fine, which I don't think really does all that much in terms of.
So we have a couple questions.
Sorry, but that was what I want to say, Suzanne.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the burden of proof. If you change to mixed motive, haven't you made it easier, that burden of proof?
You still have to prove part of the motive beyond a reasonable doubt. So you have to prove that. What it does is eliminates part of the defense that I did it for this reason, but not that reason. But you still have to prove that reason, that what was in the person's head, beyond a reasonable doubt, which is still a very hard thing to do.
Okay, Sam and then Lisa.
So would you be thinking about doing something more like preponderance of the evidence and making it civil?
So I'd like to work with Judge Cook on what she feels comfortable with in terms of so generally a judge is free to take into account a wide range of things in a sentencing recommendation. So, since this is a sentencing enhancement, we could consider, yes, making it a lower level of proof for the sentencing enhancement piece. And so it's not an element of the crime, or maybe we have a crime of bias-motivated crime and a separate sentencing enhancement that has a lower level of proof that provides some more protection.
Wait, so other questions on this point? Before, I think we want to go back to restorative justice too, but
it's more a comment about mandatory education and.
Okay, hang on a second. Do you guys have questions on what he said? Hang on one second.
So, Tom, can you clarify that in terms of what you're proposing, is it to move something substantially similar to what's being proposed forward, but then adding on to it, or are you proposing doing something different?
No, as I said, I agree completely with the proposed enhancements to the existing ordinance, but I'd like to take the opportunity to improve it as well.
Gotcha. So move forward on this, but then add some additional pieces to
Absolutely.
it. Thank you very much.
So
Other question?
And my question was probably, it sounds like what Lisa's interested in, is what do you mean by education? I mean, does this mean like?
I think that so as a parent, the last thing I do with my kids is punish them. I always try to inform, model, put peer pressure on them. There are models in the criminal justice system that use all of those things to try to change behavior. I think what we ultimately want to do in the criminal justice system is get people to change what they're doing, particularly in this area. So education can be a mandatory course. We do that in some areas. It could be contact with the victims. It could be socializing it, requiring attending a meeting of LGBTQ youth to understand their issues. We can do all of those sort of things, and I think those, in my own belief, are far more effective than simple punishment, especially if it's just a dollar amount.
Okay.
Yes, and I would say in that with restorative justice, the ultimate end of it, my understanding is that the perpetrator actually understands the harm done to the victim.
Yes.
So whatever it takes to do that, and being involved, I think, with differing groups is part of that, not just taking a course, which sounds like a pretty light way out, unless it's involved in having hands-on. So.
Sorry.
So my question was, is if you required like mandatory education, which I think is good, more than a course, but some kind of education about why they shouldn't have done that and how it makes other people feel and all this other stuff. Is there a lower burden of proof that you could require?
I believe you could. I believe there are things that you can do in the sentencing area that are different than the proof area. And so, as I said, I don't have this all modeled out in my head, and I think I want to listen to the community and see what they want, and I also want to talk to Judge Cook and see how she feels about this. But we're doing many of these things in other areas. For example, minors in possession, for first and second offense, we avoid a criminal record. We do make them take educational classes to understand what, and we screen them for alcohol or marijuana dependence to try to catch the folks who are heading down a bad path. So we've already built systems in our court to do things differently. And we actually have a study session coming up where we're going to talk about some of the more interesting things that we're all doing over there to help you inform. So there's a wide range of behavioral changing things that one can do in the criminal justice system. As I said, I think all of this is great, and I'm very supportive of what the HRC has done, and we could do that. My own little piece is I think we can do more, and I'd like the opportunity to work on that with you.
I think it's great to do that.
So I'm curious. Well, okay, so we have lots going on here. One is to address those two questions, but then go back to the list of policy recommendations and dig further. So I guess let us just clarify this and then go to the policy. Are folks in general great with the proposal before us to proceed on mixed motive and religious expression? Yes?
Yes.
Is anybody not? Okay. Can you put up the policy recommendations then?
Sorry, yes.
The 4? No.
There we go.
Okay. So we started on restorative justice, so I just wanted to finish that one. I guess, to me, it is a little, you want to be impactful, but this trade-off about not harming the victim more by, like, maybe you don't want to deal with your perpetrator. So I guess I'm just curious, and I don't know, Nikhil, if you have anything to add on this concept of how you balance that, or?
I can say, I know that I've spoken with Stan Garnett and Michael Doherty, and Stan, of course, moved restorative justice into a pilot for adult diversion in his DA's office, and then Michael's continuing that. And it's only used on specific types of crimes and not on others, so mainly like property crimes and fraud would be cases where like restorative justice would be used. On violent crimes, hate crimes, and sex crimes, it is not used. And, you know, Tom and you all could probably reach out to those officials and talk more about why. But it seems like we may be confusing two things in this discussion. One is restorative justice, and then the second is what Tom is talking about, which is mandatory education. And I know that to be an option that I've seen in cases I've observed up at the courthouse in sentencing. At judge's discretion, they will, you know, assign people to a defense attorney to contact Anti-Defamation League or some group, for instance, to help a defendant get education. So I think parsing those two out and keep it, you know, and being clear about what you want would be good. And I would recommend reaching out to them. And also SPAN and MESA as well have given feedback against restorative justice in certain types of cases.
So restorative justice in our court is mostly a program we do with CU to help change student behavior.
Correct.
And it's got a particular model. That model has been changed in various ways over the country. And one of the things you can do is not necessarily have the perpetrator meet the particular victim, but there are many people in the community who will help model better behavior. So you can build a model where the particular victim doesn't have to be involved at all. You can have people with past victims or people with just who are in a particular group that they've victimized who are willing to share their experiences. So you can build. I mean, there's a model in. Oh, I'm forgetting. There's a model where there's a standing group where the defendants go to visit. So you can build these models. And the thing about the evolution of criminal justice over the last 20 years is people are looking for ways to just solve the problem and get away from throw them in jail, throw away the key. And we can do a lot of those things. And so I'm a little hesitant to use the label restorative justice because it means a particular thing here in Boulder. And I'm not necessarily thinking that, and I'm not sure that HRC was thinking of that particular model, but any model where you take the defendant and you put him in a circumstance where you try to socialize them to different behavior, because as we all know, social modeling is the strongest way to change behavior. So if you get them into a group where the group doesn't
doesn't do the thing that they're doing, and they understand, they can start seeing the problems with their behavior, that is the most effective means for changing.
Aaron, then Sam.
So I think there are aspects of that that could be helpful. I think you need to make sure that not only are you re-victimizing the victim, but you're not inflicting sort of the pain and suffering on other members of protected classes as well. I mean, if someone commits a hate crime where they're shouting racial epithets, I don't want to make some other member of that minority group go have to deal with that either, right? And so, I think you need to be very careful about how you work that in. And there are ways that sound like that they could be very promising, but I think you'd want to be extremely delicate about this. And certainly anybody who's engaging in it, in helping perpetrators be entirely voluntary. It might be their own social groups that can help them through these things rather than re-victimizing somebody else. So,
Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite clear on the dividing line between restorative justice and education, but they both seem valuable to me. The restorative justice piece, as long as it's well considered and that the people who are working to educate the person about the impacts of their crime on the group that they committed the crime against, if there are people willing to do that, not necessarily the victim, I think that that's worth a discussion worth having. On the other hand, sometimes it's more impactful to have somebody else who's arm's length distance from the kind of tension explain in detail to the perpetrator what the impact is. Even if they're not a member of the group that was impacted, they can know and be able to communicate it. So I think something along these lines is important. What exactly it looks like, I think, should be designed by people who are experts at this. And so I would like to see it carried forward, whether it's actually restorative justice specifically or more broadly education for the perpetrators so that they get the social impact that they've created. I also think that there are some people who will be darn near immune to it. I mean, who are in some way pathological about their viewpoints of the world. And I would just ask that we recognize that if it's the case, and that if they are not good participants in the educational component or the restorative justice component, that the judge have the ability to impose a fine or short jail time to make it clear that even if they were not able to take the social cues that they've been given, that they still make some kind of restitution to the community.
Yes.
Well, instead of sending him to jail, I'd rather see him do community service. So to me, the key is, and Tom brought this up, people can pay, some people can pay easier than others. I think what works is when it becomes a pain in the derriere and you're taking time away from somebody and you're making them use time to amend their behavior. So I would want some kind of a thing that takes time from people.
Okay.
Just to reiterate, that's what I meant by hands-on, being involved time-wise with groups. And I don't know if this is the time, but I wanted to go clear back before we finish on the other piece. I didn't realize it was mentioned the hate incidents pertaining to religious expression. One of the things that wasn't included in there that I wanted to just bring up for discussion and that was referred to as clothing, articles of clothing, that one needn't necessarily be practicing or observing or in a house of worship. But if that is also something that provokes an incident, that's part of it. I didn't see that specifically in there.
That's generally included in that, correct?
It's not spelled out, I just wondered.
Oh, I think we had we gave a couple examples that have come to the commission.
You did give the
head
examples.
coverings, and then also the,
Yeah.
for Sikhs, people of religious faith who have turbans or, specific articles of faith.
Yes.
But in terms of, into the language of the law, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so we had some sample language from another community that may not have had that, but I mean, we didn't want to get too into that, but I think I'll leave it to you all to give direction to Tom on what you would like to see included. But that would be extremely helpful, is to specifically name that, as that is some of the feedback we were directly responding to. So thank you for bringing that up.
Folks agree, I assume? Okay, did you have your hand up? Okay, so let's, summing up on restorative justice is yes, with all the caveats mentioned, and also maybe we need a different word. If it's, yeah, maybe it's enforced enlightenment or something. Okay. Okay, housing status, adding homeless or housing to a protected group. What do people think of that? Yep.
As Clay said, we've had some recent incidents where some of our homeless population have been bullied or beat by deadbeats. What else can I call them? But they have adversely affected these people. And I think a lot of times our homeless population is very vulnerable because they have no place to turn. And so somehow we do need to include them as a protected class. And I don't want them, while they may be violating some of our rules on camping, that should not bring a beating from some deadbeat. And there should be some way that this homeless person can get some help or restitution or something. But I feel like homeless people can be really picked on more than other people because of this very vulnerable
stigma
situation.
Cindy?
So I agree with Lisa, and I'm specifically thinking of the man who came to testify before the city council last year who had been attacked, and there was a series of attacks against homeless people in the dark of night, early in the morning. And simply because persons are in that state does not mean they should be victims to that kind of thing happening.
Sam and then Bob.
Well, I'll say yes to the housing status question. I think that is a good way to put it because it covers the whole spectrum of housing status. I would also just tie it in with number one and say that I think all of the things in number one, as far as the identification of different classes of folks, tie in with number three. Housing status is just one of those that's important. I also think it's, oftentimes assaults on homeless folks are perpetrated by other folks who may be unhoused. And so I think even in that case, we still need to consider that a mixed motive crime and still treat that as a hate crime because it is an assault on someone for perhaps that reason. And so I just want to be clear that even if the attack were done by someone else unhoused on a victim who's unhoused, I think we still need to consider that potentially a hate crime.
I have a question for Tom on this one, because the traditional protected classes tend to be characteristics or of the person or sometimes their faith. This seems to be a status, and somebody could be homeless one day and housed the next day and homeless the next day. I mean, it's not like people are permanently homeless or not permanently homeless. And it seems to me that there are potentially some legal issues around proof, around status, around whether the perpetrator was aware. Because obviously to be a hate crime, I presume that one of the elements would be awareness of the person's characteristic. And I don't know how you are aware of the fact that someone has a permanent address or doesn't have a permanent address simply by how they appear. So I'm just asking, I guess, a series of questions around the legal aspect of adding this as a protected class. Does that present some challenges?
Bob, I haven't researched it yet. I know there are places around the country where this has been done, and I'd want to look at the way they did it. I think you identify some of the challenges, but I don't know that they're insurmountable. I think you just have to have some clear characteristics that would signal to the defendant that they're violating the law. And so I think it's probably doable, but I'd want to take a look and see what other people have done.
Aaron?
Yeah, I support moving this forward as well. I would really like to learn more before we finalized an ordinance about how some of these that are the protected classes, it wouldn't always be obvious. Like one of them is parenthood. So if you just see somebody, you don't necessarily know that they're a parent, right? So how does that play out in a hate crime? So what would be the way that someone would victimize someone that would trigger a hate crime for being a parent or being homeless or something like that? So I just want to dig into how that would work when we come back to it.
Being a parent?
Parenthood is one of our protected classes in the Human Rights Ordinance. So it's one of the items in number 1.
I think I didn't see that. Well, at some point, I'm going to ask a dumb question. If we have such a long list, do we, maybe this is a dumb question, but do we water down the impact of focusing on, part of it is to educate the community about, hey, we've been seeing more of religious persecution or racial persecution, and we are underscoring that that's not okay. So anyhow, I guess there's a part of me that says, well, let's just, if we put everybody on the list, we're just maybe not making that point as well. So I'm not talking about housing status necessarily, because to me that, but I just wonder at some point. So when we go through 1, I kind of, sorry, I don't want to skip to 1. We're finishing 3, but anyhow, I just make that point or ask that question.
Colloquy back because Sam jumped to number 1, but I agree, and so I'm fine discussing this, but I want to think about it very carefully when we come time to do an ordinance because of the same concerns about potentially diluting the very serious hate crimes that sometimes we see.
Okay, is there anything else on number 3? Can we just continue this conversation, jump to number 1? Yeah.
So I find some of the proposed categories in number 1 to be quite important and directly in line with what we're talking about, like creed, sex, immigration status. For instance, I think all of those we do definitely want to call out. I don't know about some of the things like parenthood or custody of a minor child. Marital status seems to me like that could be, depending on who's married to whom and how it comes about, that could also be one that's very deserving of being called out in particular. So I think there are some in here that maybe rise to the level for me of really wanting to make sure that they're specifically called out. And maybe there are some that we could talk about as perhaps not having the same level of import. But I really, creed, sex, definitely immigration status, potentially marital status and source of income, I think those are potentially basis of hate crimes and discrimination.
Well, I don't want to go into personal stuff, but I'm going to say you've got to include parent.
So educate me. People, I just don't understand why would that be a cause for someone to hate, given that everybody had a parent?
When I was having my 3rd child, I was pregnant, very pregnant, and I had somebody come up to me in a grocery store and scream at me that I already had 2 children. This was not PC. And then followed us out. And it's like, that stuff just shouldn't happen. I mean, people should not be able to just go up to other people and accuse them of something or hassle them and then follow them after the encounter is passed. So.
Okay. Other thoughts on number 1? What?
Just one more thing. So, maybe what we could get is at this next iteration a little bit more of a recommendation. If you dive into the different rather than just say, yeah, take them all. Really, think them through and then come up with a recommendation that we could then chew over and as part of our decision.
Were you trying to jump in? Oh. Okay. Others. To me, that sounds like a good idea. Does that sound right? Okay. 2. mandate of police training. Well, okay, I'll just wait on this. My understanding is because it's been difficult to prosecute, given the burden of proof and the whole mixed motive thing, it hasn't happened very often. So certainly some clarification, especially if we train the law on how that works now, would be in order at a minimum. I don't know, other thoughts on this? Cindy?
I agree. Suzanne, I think as we move forward into strengthening it, that it would be well to bring up the police force who are going to be implementing so that they know where things stand.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very serious issue in this day and age, and so I think it's well worth taking the time to make sure that everyone understands, speaks the same language, understands what the crimes are that they need to be looking out for and arresting for.
Tom?
So I just wanted to suggest that perhaps rather than use the word mandate, use coordinate or cooperate with the police department, because I think one of the things I'd like to do is get their experience, because they're the ones out in the street who are seeing these things, and to help them, work with them to develop the ordinance. And my guess, knowing our police department, is they already do anti-bias training. And so that's not an issue. It's more, how do we make this the most effective program? And working with them and getting their wisdom and understanding as part of the process would be really helpful.
Okay. So I guess that's on those four. I guess in terms of process, you guys mentioned feedback fatigue. And I guess one of my questions is, some of this, like the mixed motive, the religious expression, some of this stuff, I think you could probably go and write an ordinance today. And it seems to me that sometimes that's what brings people to the table is, here, this is what we're thinking. Does this look right, or how would you edit it? As opposed to, hey, what do you think about a concept? And since I feel like we've talked about this concept, that we should go ahead and take the next step of putting stuff on paper and getting specific feedback, in particular on a few of these things we've highlighted, like how, which of the protected classes, or would you prioritize, or however you want to do it. So I'll just throw that out there. Yes?
Suzanne, I agree. I think we should and can move forward. And there was a to be determined in terms of timeline. This, again, I think is something very important because it has to do with the community knowing that we are trying to protect to the best of our ability, and we're not going to put up with the underlying stuff that's going on that's causing this kind of disruption. So I think it'd be great.
Can you put up the process next step size?
So just to help a little bit, we did our quarterly dot exercise where we sort of laid out the council's agenda for the next quarter. We put this on for second reading public hearing on August 2nd. So and I've been thinking about that date as the date when we would bring back the ordinance, so having gone through the whole process by then. So if that's acceptable, then it's already built into your schedule for the summer.
August 2nd.
August 2nd is the date I believe the date we put on.
So has HRC, you've had a public hearing, haven't you?
Yes, we've had public hearings, like Suzanne had mentioned, around open concepts like diversity and inclusivity, and then specifically on bias and hate crimes, and got plenty of feedback on them.
But do you want to have another one? Would you do another one, or do you think they would rather just come to council?
I think the way we've done it in the past, and this was kind of my take on these next steps, was, similar to other kind of complex policies that, like living wage, for instance, we had, 1.5 years of public hearings and things, which is kind of what we've done on this. We gave recommendations, handed them off to you, and then, not much else we can do, and it's really up to you all and city attorney to come up with something. When that's, when Tom comes back with, has something that people can react to that's going to go to you on a first reading, we can schedule that at our commission to do a public hearing on that item, and I think that might work well, and then the rest of it would be, the hearing process at council meetings.
So there'd be like one public hearing with HRC, and then when the ordinance came forward, of course, people would speak to that.
But wouldn't their hearing be on a draft ordinance first?
Right, I
Okay.
assume.
Yeah, so anyhow. So when you have a draft ordinance, it goes to them first with some of the questions, if there's some
So I
outstanding
think we
ones.
just take that August 2nd date and work back for it and make sure we meet it.
That sound
I
good?
don't think it's that hard. I think we can get this done.
Okay, cool. We good on this?
Final topic?
Yep.
Okay. Again, a similar structure to our discussion. A little bit of background. This was brought to us around last summer by Boulder. They were sort of the point organization on this. And the last time we've looked at this language was about 18 years ago. So I was looking at some of the legislative history underlying this. And essentially, I think there's a couple of dynamics at play here, is that the thought process has become more advanced and more granular since 18 years ago. There's, I think, a greater sensitivity and understanding about where people that are impacted by this are coming from. And it really did, going through the language, it became apparent that there are things that probably could use some improvement. And Commissioner Loberg, am I missing anything in the sort of prefatory thing? I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but okay, all right. So, hopefully you've had an opportunity to examine the enclosed attachment, which really gets into a pretty high level of detail with respect to what some of these proposed changes are. And this is really just sort of a high level summary of those changes, and so that we don't have to go into every particular change. But there's a lot of definitional changes that we're looking at. A lot of the language that was in the stuff from 18 years ago is really kind of no longer considered the best thinking on a lot of this. There are language we have, for example, such as that pertaining to the number of times that you can express your gender in different ways. There was like a limitation of 3. That is found to be offensive, and that is something that should be deleted. And there's also some issues too around public accommodation. And I know that the CAO has identified there are some instances where we might have to do a little bit of refinement because some of the proposed language may contradict some other pieces of language. And I believe that pertains to sort of segregated sports facilities, where in one instance it seems like we can do that and maybe another instance we cannot. So I think it's just sort of a clarification conversation that needs to happen about some of the proposed changes. The last piece, and it's a little bit similar to the discussion that we have had on things that sort of can enforce, that sort of support this but aren't necessarily part of exactly what we're talking about here, is amendments to the Human Rights Ordinance to address enforcement barriers. So there are some issues around statute of limitations and the tolling of that we might want to consider. And also, and this was a little bit of a surprise, and sort of going and looking at the language, we may, in the section 12, which covers human rights, we don't really have a definition of discrimination. So that's something that we may want to assess. Community engagement piece, it's a little perhaps different from what we talked about in the previous example. It basically, I think that there's probably a need for more outreach. We don't have the pre-existing sort of body of engagement that we've had with some of the hate crimes piece. So we would have to, and we have been working a bit on this, development of a list of stakeholders and what that outreach would look like. And then similar to what we're talking about with the hate crime sentence enhancement changes, looking at different options for the public outreach piece. Again, a proposed next steps piece, and whether or not, actually, okay, this is, yes, okay. Oh, and another, I just want to back up a little bit. There were some pieces in the original Boulder proposal dealing with the sort of sexes versus gender language, and that was addressed in our last election, that the voters approved that change. So at least some of the proposal is off the table because we've already accepted and integrated that into our changes. The other final piece that makes this a little bit different is there's a little bit of a trickle-down effect that if we make these changes, we may see those would in turn be reflected in things like board and commission handbooks, other policies, just so that we have consistency up and down the city in terms of our documentation. So let me present
Before you do that,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt, but your next steps, there's a lot about voters vote on a ballot initiative. My understanding is that there's actually nothing that requires.
Yeah, I think that is correct, and I think this was sort of this was sort of an outmoded piece. I apologize for that.
So we'll think about other timelines that would be based just on an ordinance rather than a vote. Yep. Great,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, sorry about that. So lastly, this is kind of the council question, to essentially look at these changes, see what needs to be clarified or adjusted, and then move forward on that. But before we dive into it, just Commissioner Loberg, if there's any insight. Commissioner Loberg was very instrumental, sort of the point person on the HRC in working with this, liaising with Boulder, so certainly would like to hear their perspective.
Thanks, Clay. Just to add on about the motivations for encouraging you all to direct the city staff and city attorney's office to move forward with these changes. We're calling this inclusive language, but it's also just more accurate, more affirming, and does a better job of ensuring the rights of the entire transgender community in Boulder. I think one thing in addition to what Clay has mentioned is that there's some language that might be, I believe, unintentionally exclusive of portions of the transgender community. Also some, I think, other unintended consequences. Current language, I think, discourages participation in city government by transgender people, discourages use of protections like the Human Rights Ordinance, because when there is language like there currently is that, like Clay said, is offensive and not affirming it, makes you wonder if the entity on the other end is going to be supportive. Some really real impacts here. And yes, communicates whether or not Boulder is a safe and welcoming place for the trans community. So, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Commissioner Loberg.
Thank you.
And I would just like to, maybe reiterate before we get to the final question here is really the public engagement process. And I think because of the nature of what we're talking about, I think that it's something that we need to approach with great sensitivity and with a good deal of just really making sure that we're identifying the right stakeholders to be at the table. It seems that it's been a little bit different from the process that we've dealt with respect to the hate crime sentence enhancement. Certainly Boulder is a leading group, but we just want to make sure that we're addressing all the appropriate stakeholders and generating that group. I mean, to that end, the HRC commissioners have helped to start to generate a list of folks to work with, and as staff, we've been in very close contact with the community engagement folks to figure out the mechanisms that might be, most effective. Because I think another piece too is, and a couple events in the last few days have made me a little more sensitive to this, is, not everybody may wish to weigh in on this through a public hearing and coming into council chambers, and that is more than understandable. So I think we do have to look at other mechanisms for people to weigh in that may feel, safer, and to make folks feel less vulnerable in expressing kind of what their needs are.
Can I ask a question about that? Would the starting place be the Boulder proposed edits and take those out in whatever forms feel safe to get feedback on? Is that the proposed? And then okay.
Yes.
Because that makes sense. Again, I think it's useful to have people respond to something. Yeah.
Two things. Lindsay, thanks for bringing this forward. This is fantastic. Question then for Tom. Based upon the engagement summary that Zan just suggested, would it be possible to move this in parallel, again, moving against that August 2nd date, working backwards through ordinances, through community engagement, through HRC, public hearing? Is that possible from your perspective? I'll ask the same question to Nikhil in a second.
From my perspective, the drafting is not challenging.
Okay.
It's the community engagement.
Sure.
And one of the things I'd like to say is that when they did this 18 years ago, a lot of people contributed in what was in many ways a groundbreaking ordinance, and I'd want to honor those folks as well and make sure that we don't unintentionally
hurt someone. I think that's what Clay's saying.
Right.
So the community engagement piece of this is so much more important. So assuming that can get done, I can write whatever they tell me to write.
Right.
But we do need to make sure that we don't do harm when we're trying to do the right thing.
So just to pivot to you guys, both staff and HRC, do you think that the community engagement can happen over the course of the next 4 to 5 months, sensitive to appropriate ways to engage folks so that Tom can have the feedback he needs to do the drafting?
Speaking from a staff perspective, we were fully anticipating that.
Okay. And Nikhil and Lindsay, do you think that's doable for you guys?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
The point that this ordinance that we changed 18 years ago, there was a lot of community involvement. So it's important to reach out to those individuals.
Aaron?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thanks so much for taking this up, and Lindsay, to you in particular, for moving this forward. And so, yeah, we do want to listen to folks who were involved the last time around, but I know thinking has changed since then. Yeah. And, our language in our code is not fully inclusive right now, and sometimes somewhere in between embarrassing and offensive. So I'm really glad that we can take this on and make these changes to have our code be more reflective of our community.
Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I want to agree with Aaron here. I was kind of surprised by some of the things that I read that were still in there. And, 18 years ago has been a long time ago. It's most of a generation ago. And a lot of things have changed in the intervening years. And so while I do want to be respectful of the former contributors in council, I also think that everyone would recognize that a lot has changed in the past 18 years. And we want to make sure that we are not offensive in our code and that we are not in any way exclusionary in our code. So I think the charter change that you proposed that the voters approved is a first step, and then this just goes on down to correcting things in ordinance. So thank you for bringing it forward.
No, I'm very happy to be moving this forward, and reading the changes are great. And thank you so much, Lindsay, for everything you've done to make that happen, and thank Out Boulder as well.
Thank you, and big thanks to Out Boulder for moving it forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate their work.
And I would, yes, thank you to you and to Out Boulder. To the extent that then there's work that flows, then we have to change handbooks and stuff, I guess. Let's not let the total project get in the way of getting the ordinance done, and stuff can flow from that if it has to. Obviously, the faster we move, the better, but I just note that there may be more that comes down the pike, but let's get this body of work done this year if we can. And it sounds like we can, so that's exciting.
August 2nd.
All right.
Okay.
Got it on the calendar.
So anything else do you need from us?
I think we're in good shape. I believe all our questions have been addressed. My colleague, Eitan Cantor, will be developing, I believe, the summary points memo in the next day or so for folks. I'm actually leaving on vacation, but I will be back. So if people have questions, I'll be available for folks come Tuesday. I just want to make sure that the commissioners, have we covered everything that need to be covered this evening?
Yes, I think so. And I have been thinking about Lisa's last question to me about the holding an extra public hearing or letting the council take that on with the hate crimes ordinance. And so what I think I may have gotten confused, but what I think is that as it goes, Tom's plan is to have that go to you on second reading in August and have you have your own public hearing process. I think we would be fine with leaving it to that. And what I was referencing was when Tom has something that he's obviously going to get to you, to send it to HRC so the commission can have it as an action item for us to discuss and vote up to you to give the final thumbs up, kind of like the towing law and stuff.
I just wanted to thank all of the people who wrote. It was voluminous and it was really helpful and insightful. So thanks again to our community.
I just want to say thank you to many community members who have been on the hate crimes and many of the Human Relations Commission issues, and I know a lot of them have been really supportive of writing into you, so shout out to them, because, I mean, without really these community-driven efforts, that's what really pushes all of these Human Relations Commission initiatives that have been brought to you. And so, the Commission is happy to take them on, and it's really pleasing to see both the community involvement and then the council support on the other end, and what we can do in between is it's an absolute pleasure.
And while we're having a love fest here, thanks so much to the HRC as a whole, Lindsay and Nikhil here, but I see the entire rest of the commission out there, Sharon and Art and Stan.
And Art.
So thanks so much for being here and for all of your hard work on these issues.
Thank you.
Wow. Is there anybody we haven't thanked?
The audience.
Yes. All right. Well, on that note, thank you and good night.
Live from Paris, en France 24.